The Vampire Tales, Called by Midnight, Fae Wilds Series, Book 8, written by W.J. May, copyright 2023 by W.J. May, narrated by Kathleen Starr Hall. Chapter 13. She woke suddenly at the sensation of her body hitting the ground. Hollie's eyes flew open, and she was greeted with pandemonium occurring all around her. She attempted to lift herself, to come to her feet, but the chains were still twisted around her. It took a moment for her mind to process what was happening. So much was going on around her. A burst of sparks hit the wall beside her head, and Hollie ducked, tracing the burst back to its source. "Cass!" The witch stood there, her face tinged with green, her expression saying she'd rather be anywhere else in the world, but still sparks flew from her fingertips in the direction of the Dark Lady. And the witch wasn't alone. Taylor and Phaedra were on either side of her, lashing out at Nev with twin whips made of vine. The chamber filled with acrid smoke without warning, and Hollie coughed, her eyes starting to water. She could no longer see the melee taking place, but when a familiar roar shook the room, a smile came to her lips. Her vampire was here. My vampire, she thought in a daze. When did I start thinking of him as mine? The smoke cleared as suddenly as it came, and Hollie blinked away tears to find Taylor and Phaedra hacking at their own vines, which had encircled them and laid them low. Cass was pounding against some invisible wall that had her trapped behind it, a frantic expression on her face. Maz, however, was still untouched. He flitted in and out of sight, teleporting every half-second to a new location around the room, trying to keep from being pinpointed by their adversary. The trick seemed to work for a few moments before Nev started making shapes with her hands to weave an electrified net that swept through the room, catching the vampire up and shocking him fiercely. Nev laughed as the vamp tumbled to the ground. Turning to Hollie, she gave her a playful smile. "I guess you weren't lying about everything. There is a vampire. And from the expression on his face right now, I'd say he's protecting his mate." Her words stung. Hollie didn't bother to answer, her eyes shooting to Maz to make sure he was all right. His eyes met hers, and she could see the ferocity in them. Maybe they're all right, she thought then. Maybe I am his mate. Maz was on his feet in seconds, disappearing only to reappear behind Nev. He grabbed at her throat, but she somehow managed to rotate her body without moving, her back suddenly becoming her front. "Hey there, big boy," she said, miming a smooch. "You're easy on the eyes. No wonder she was trying to protect you." It seemed the Dark Lady had picked up on some of what Hollie was trying to hide. Hollie watched as she picked up the vampire and flung him across the room. He collided with the wall, sending up a shower of stones and debris. That's when she saw the first flicker. Hollie blinked, shaking her head and telling herself she hadn't seen what she just thought she saw. Then Phaedra was up and barreling toward Nev with her sword drawn. Taylor was pounding outside of the invisible box holding Cass, who was now tapping weakly against the glass, her face turning purple. "She can't breathe." Phaedra swung her sword but hit nothing but air, Nev having vanished only to reappear behind her. The Dark Lady kicked the back of Phaedra's knee, making the Fae warrior stumble. Confident that the Fae could hold her own, Hollie started wrestling against her chains, trying to free herself. "I've got to help Cass." The witch was fading, her hands at her throat, her mouth wide open and gasping for air. No matter how hard Hollie struggled, however, the chains remained in place. Then she heard the whirring noise beside her. She turned her head to take in Windy, who was sawing at his own chains with what resembled a miniature chainsaw that had come out of a panel in the robot's chest. A small rain of sparks flew up, and Hollie's eyes cut to Nev, afraid their enemy might catch the bot in the act, but she had her hands full with Maz and Phaedra, who were taking turns striking out at her quick, their blows too fast for the human eye to follow. They weren't fast enough for Nev, however, as she laughed, then grabbed both fighters by their throats, banging their heads together before letting them drop. "She's having fun," Hollie realized with a sick feeling in the pit of her stomach. "She's toying with us. At any moment she could strike us all dead as easy as brushing off a fly." The sheer power the woman wielded was beyond Hollie's comprehension. The sound of a link in the chain busting open drew Hollie's attention back to Windy, who was swiftly unraveling the chains around him. The little robot rolled toward her, chainsaw extended, but Hollie shook her head. "Help Cass! See if you can cut through whatever is keeping her stuck inside with no oxygen." Lights cascaded inside Windy's dome, but he did as she told him. Hollie watched, hands balled into fists, every muscle clenched. She knew she'd be useless in this fight. How could I take out someone who can hold off an ancient vampire and Fae warrior without even breaking a sweat? In a dress and bustle, no less. Nev was now waltzing around the chamber, humming to herself as Phaedra and Maz traded attempts at attacking her. As far as Hollie could see, neither managed to lay a finger on her. Meanwhile, Cass was now lying motionless on the floor, the walls of her invisible cage holding up to the onslaught of Fae magic and advanced technology. That's when Hollie had an idea. The only contribution she had to make to a battle like this. It's time to act my ass off. "Ahriman, at last!" she yelled, welching as Nev's shoulders hunched. The dark lady whirled around, entirely distracted. "Ahriman!" she called, her eyes darting around the room, looking for the Prince of Darkness. In that instant, Phaedra's wings flapped, and she shot into the air, aiming a devastating kick right at Nev's skull. She moved to block it, but not fast enough, and Phaedra's foot connected. Nev rocked backwards, and the chamber flickered again, this time more than once, long enough for Hollie to see the dank stone walls replaced by dreary plaster walls the color of sand. "Is that a mop in the corner?" she wondered, blinking. When she opened her eyes, the dungeon wall was back, only to be replaced by plaster again. "That is a mop! And a bucket!" Reality returned to rights just as two ropes of bright green energy shot from Nev's hands, winding their way up Phaedra's legs. The Fae screamed in pain, struggling as she plummeted to the ground. Then Maz was on Nev's back, his claw-tipped hands digging into the soft flesh of her throat. Suddenly, the skin under his hands sprouted a layer of thick, dark feathers that repelled his attacks. Nev laughed, then yanked him from her back, only to dash his head against the stone wall. Maz's body dropped from her hand, and she turned her back on him, chuckling. "Looks like the game is almost over," Nev said, dusting off her hands. Hollie's gaze took in the scene, her heart aching for her friends. Cass was unconscious, possibly dead, cut off from her air supply. Taylor was wrestling with the ropes encircling Phaedra's thighs that seemed to be squeezing tighter and tighter. The Fae's muscles were already straining, her skin bruised and ugly purple, and Maz lay motionless. "Such a pity, isn't it, Ahriman?" she called out, her gaze still flicking around the room. "If you wanted a fight, brother, then why send such weak creatures? Why not challenge me yourself?" "Brother?" Hollie wondered how much longer the woman would believe her ruse, that she had seen Ahriman in the chamber. As soon as she figures it out, I'm toast. A 2-inch rocket whizzed its way across the room, embedding itself in Nev's back. She hunched, her skin exploding in feathers a split second before the missile exploded, bathing the room in bright light. Nev whirled around, her eyes narrowing as she took in the small red robot who was standing before her, fearless. Hollie's heart was in her throat, worried that she was about to witness the destruction of her little bot companion. Power crackled at Nev's fingertips as she held out a hand toward Wendy. A bolt of pure energy shot from her at the bot, but just before it reached him, Maz suddenly appeared in front of him, aiming something in Nev's direction. The beam hit his hand and bounced off it somehow, shooting right back in Nev's direction. The blast of energy hit the dark lady in the chest, and she screeched in genuine pain. A burst of black feathers exploded, and suddenly she was gone. Hollie collapsed in a heap, feeling on the verge of vomiting. Then she staggered to her feet, her eyes on Cass. Taylor was at the witch's side in an instant, her hands glowing as they touched her motionless body. Phaedra's hands joined hers, and Hollie saw Cass's body jump. The witch's eyes shot open, and Hollie let out a cry of relief. She looked down at the sound of a chain link exploding. Large hands were pulling the chains from her body, freeing her. She looked up into the concerned features of Maz. "Are you all right?" Hollie nodded without speaking. He pulled her into an embrace, holding her tightly, and she didn't fight him. She could feel his need radiating from him, and she knew he needed to make sure she was okay for himself. "How did you do that? At the end there? It looks like you somehow caught her spell and threw it back at her," she asked him. Maz held up his hand for her to see the mirror held in his palm. "I reflected her hex back at her." Wendy appeared at her knee, lights firing furiously in his dome. "I knew this couldn't have been an exit. It was impossible." Hollie looked up, realizing what the bot was saying. They were no longer in a gloomy dungeon, but instead they were 5 people and a robot crammed into an average storage closet. "I thought that was a mop." We never left the workshop, Hollie breathed, realizing that Nev had thoroughly tricked them. What do you mean, left the workshop? Phaedra asked, coming to her feet beside Cass, who was now sitting up with Taylor's support. We're in the workshop's dungeon, I thought.
She must have the ability to bend reality or weave an illusion so close to it that it's practically the same thing, Wendy postulated. We are lucky that we escaped with our lives.
Maz clutched her tighter, and Hollie swallowed hard. She noticed Phaedra heading in their direction, a look of determination on her gorgeous features. Okay, Vamp, she said, her tone hard. We lived up to our end of the bargain. Time for you to live up to yours. Before Phaedra could come within striking distance, Maz spun around, protecting Hollie with his body and hissing in the Fae's direction. Knock it off, leech, Phaedra told him with a scowl marring her otherwise perfect face. She's mine, Hollie heard Maz say, his voice thick with emotion. Then the familiar whoosh hit her stomach, and she knew they were traveling. Chapter 14. The tapestry that dominated the wall in front of her featured rolling green hills backlit by a magnificent dawn, rays shooting up into the atmosphere in every conceivable shade of golden thread. The irony of a vampire decorating his lair with images of sunrises was not lost on her. At least I assume this is his lair. Hollie looked around the chamber, noting how sumptuously it was decorated. Expensive fabrics on antique furnishings, art and tapestries, each featuring a rising sun, covered the gleaming wood-paneled walls, and night-blooming flowers sprang from vases all over the room. Could you please let me go? She said softly to the vampire, who was still wrapped around her. But it wasn't Maz who released his grip.
Sorry about that,
Wendy said, rolling out from under her skirt. He must have latched on to me at the last second before Maz teleported us here.
Just following protocol.
Hollie remembered then how Crash had demanded that the bot never leave her side. He'd failed to prevent her escape from the workshop, however, although she assumed he'd earned an exemption on that once, given the extenuating circumstances. Where are we? She asked gently after extracting herself from Maz's grip. We are safe, he replied, sniffing. When she continued to look at him, not accepting his lack of an answer, he continued, We are in my own pocket dimension, a place I have never brought another living soul. Looking down at the robot, he let out a small hiss. A place that no one used to know about. Wendy put a little distance between himself and the angry vampire. Hollie inserted herself between them, putting a calming hand on Maz's chest. This is like the bubble we were in before, she asked, relieved when he nodded. She fell onto a nearby sofa, letting out a sigh of pure comfort. The quiet of the pocket realm was a large shift after the chaos of the fight moments before, but before her mind could settle itself, she recalled that the entire thing had been started by their invasion of Nev's bubble. Speaking of pocket dimensions, Hollie said in a conversational tone, that woman who was torturing me for information, turns out she owned the mirrored bubble we busted into and ripped apart. Maz's eyes widened. That is why she came after you. Hollie nodded. She called herself Nev, but I have no idea if that was truly her name. Hollie gave him a brief rundown of events, detailing the pretend apprentice's ruse. Before I knew it, she had me in chains. Maz scowled, running his hands through his hair in agitation. I heard your scream, and I could not stop myself. I ran for you. And when I saw you in chains, I wanted to rip the head from that foul woman's shoulders. But she was so bloody strong. Hollie couldn't disagree. She said something in the heat of battle. When she was torturing me, I told her about Dallin and his intent to trade me to Ahriman for his freedom. She seemed extremely interested in that name and in Samael's. In order to distract her during the fight, I called out Ahriman's name as if I'd seen him in the room with us. She fell for it and called him her brother. That is not possible, Maz muttered. There are 5 princes of darkness. No one has ever mentioned another sibling. No princess of darkness, then? Hollie asked. Are you sure? Because she seemed like she could hold that title easily. The vampire looked shaken. A week ago, I would have said I was certain. Now I cannot say. There is something afoot, something we don't understand. I think Samael senses it. Senses it or is at its center. What if she keeps coming after me? Hollie said, her voice low as the realization dawned on her. She wouldn't believe me when I told her we ended up in her realm due to a magical mishap and hadn't sought it out. She thinks we were up to something nefarious. Now she thinks we're in league with her brothers. She could be looking for us even now. Which is why we will stay here where it is safe, Maz reiterated, sitting on the sofa beside her. We have everything here that we could need. Everything, huh? She asked, giving him a look. You're telling me that a vampire bachelor has food for humans, clothing, feminine products, and cell phone chargers? All but the last item, yes, Maz said with a nod. Hollie burst out laughing. I don't believe you. Why would you have those things? A possible reason popped into her head, and she frowned. Is this your little leech love nest? She asked, surprised at the ferocity of the jealousy that filled her. You bring all the girls back to your pad for a little coffin and chill? When he shook his head, an even worse hypothesis entered her brain. This is where you bring your victims? A look of horror took up residence on her face. You lure them here, keep them until you're bored, then drain them? I told you. I have never had anyone here. It has only been me until now. His words had a ring of truth to them, and Hollie wanted to believe him, but a part of her was skeptical. He was old, really old. Could he really have remained alone here for so long? How can I believe you, no matter how much I want to?
I've done a simple DNA sampling of the premises,
Wendy piped up from his place in the doorway between this room and the next.
It bears out his words. There is no evidence of any other life form having been in this realm except for the vampire and us.
Hollie looked at Maz, who gave her a small smile. Perhaps you won't be so quick to jump to conclusions next time, he said, then put his arm around her. But I must say, I liked your little flash of jealousy. It excited me. Your spirit is a source of constant satisfaction. Hollie stuck a tongue out at him, making him laugh. She grinned, realizing that she hadn't felt this relaxed in what felt like ages. It was nice. Then she remembered her friends, who were no doubt searching for her as they sat here joking. We've got to go back, she said, the cheer going out of her voice. Maz's smile vanished. Absolutely not. You know Phaedra is going to be furious, she told him. How you got her to agree to work with you, I'll never understand, but you can bet she won't be quick to trust you again since you just abducted me again. His fangs flashed. Phaedra will never accept me. I am a vampire, anathema, the opposite of the very essence of her being. He gave her a look of such intensity that Hollie's insides caught fire. I will not let you go, no matter what the Fae thinks. They helped you find me, she reminded him gently. And they will keep you from me, he countered. You said yourself that we're wrapped up in something bigger than ourselves, something we don't understand. Maybe we should stick close to our allies then. It wouldn't hurt to have some power on our side. They are your allies, he told her, and they are no match for what stands against us. It is safer for us to stay here. No one can find us. No one can trouble us. And you'd be content to spend eternity in your little bubble all alone? She asked, getting heated. You might be a homebody, but a girl likes to get out every now and again. Maz smiled. I will keep you entertained, dumpling, he said, taking her hand in his. You will not miss the world you came from. You might be right about that, but it still doesn't mean I'm signing myself up for a life sentence. And what about after I die? Humans don't live long, you know, especially in comparison to immortals. What happens when you're stuck here all alone after I'm dead? There is no after you're dead, he told her with a solemn expression. A chill went through her, and she didn't push him, but she wasn't sure if he meant he would refuse to go on after she died or whether he meant she would never die. It was a thought she couldn't face yet. Maz, we can't hole up here and pretend the outside world doesn't exist. It isn't fair to us or to the world. He opened his mouth to respond, but Hollie didn't hear a word. A sudden voice appeared in her brain, hijacking her attention. It was Cass, and she sounded harried. I don't know where that vamp of yours whisked you off to this time, but could you come back? We've gotten ourselves captured by an army of robots. You owe us a little help here. The voice disappeared, and Hollie shook her head. Cass just spoke to me inside my mind. Maz cocked an eyebrow. What did she say? They've been captured by robots and need help, Hollie stood. Let's go help them. The vampire leaned back against the couch, crossing his arms over his chest. We are going nowhere. I have already told you. You can't be serious. She was in no mood to argue. I told you, I'm not signing up to be your roommate for eternity, Maz. They just helped you rescue me. We've got to go help them right now. I just got you back, he snapped. There's no way I'm risking you all over again. She sat down beside him, realizing the emotional toll the conversation was having on him. I know you want to keep me safe, want to keep me wrapped up in your bubble so that nothing can touch me, but it isn't realistic, and I won't betray my friends like this. I can't. She took his hand and squeezed it. We've got to go back. His face was like stone. He was silent for a long moment, then let out a sigh. There's only one condition under which I will allow us to leave the safety of my realm, he said, his voice heavy. One and one alone. What is this condition? She asked warily. Whatever he was about to say, she was halfway to positive that she wasn't going to like it. I can't risk letting you slip out of my grasp again. It is too easy to lose you, to not know your location. I want some assurance that I'll know where you are when I need to. Hollie shrugged. I don't know what to tell you, big boy. Unless you've got a smartphone tucked somewhere in that coat of yours, I can't help you. But if you want, I'll put you on my plan and share my location with you. He looked at her as if she was speaking a foreign language. I don't know what a smartphone is, but I have an easier solution. In order to pinpoint you in space, I only need a little taste of your blood. Hollie looked stunned, then told herself she must have misheard him. I'm sorry, you need what? To taste you. Just the tiniest sip. Then we won't be separated again. His face was impassive, but she could see the intensity in his eyes. This was something he wanted very badly. She shivered, envisioning the sensation of his fangs piercing the soft skin of her neck. A bite from a real live vampire, or my friends remain imprisoned. Most gals my age are deciding between which fad diet to try or the type of nail art that's hottest on social media nowadays. How come I get the hard choices? Hollie bit her lip, debating her answer. If I choose one way, people could get hurt. I choose the other, and I know I'll get hurt. Which decision was the right one? Like everything else when it came to Maz, she had no earthly idea. Chapter 15. I think the phone plan is easier, Hollie said, shaking her head and scooting away from him on the sofa. Matter of fact, why don't we put a pin in the whole discussion? When we get back to Earth, I'll take you to the mall and get you the latest in mobile tech, but for now, let's go help our friends. They're your friends, he corrected, and you won't be able to end this discussion so easily. He watched her frown, and it pricked at him. I hate to see her sad. Even a hint of sorrow makes my heart ache. Unfortunately, there had been precious little for Hollie to smile about of late. It made him doubt the timing of his request, but he'd felt justified in making it. He knew he was taking a massive risk, one that could blow up in his face, but nothing could stop him from asking. Instinct was riding him hard. After all they'd been through, every fiber of his being was screaming at him to bite her, to claim her, to brand her as his mate for eternity. He was nearly powerless against the onslaught of matehood and his need to protect and provide for her. Still, he managed to keep himself in check, managed not to show her what sort of ravening beast lay just below the surface. The fact that he was able to have a calm conversation about tasting her proved how well he was doing at reining in his emotions. That didn't mean that he wasn't a moment away of losing it every second he spent next to his mate. The scent that floated above her auburn waves intoxicated him. The flush of her skin when she was excited, the twinkle of mischief in her eye, the laugh that reminded him of the tinkling of 1,000 tiny bells, all of it drove him wild. But it was not his wild side that she needed to see. He knew that he needed to convince her, and to do that, he had to remain rational. At his silence, Hollie let out a noise of frustration. "What is it exactly that you want from me?" she asked, her expression skeptical. "A taste of your blood. It will ensure that I will be able to find you again should I lose you, as I seem to have a habit of doing, through no shortage of attempts to the contrary." So you're telling me that swallowing my blood is like installing some sort of homing beacon in your system so you can track me down somehow, like a bloodhound with a scent? Something like that, he admitted, leaving out that he could already smell better than a dozen bloodhounds. So you can see how it would come in handy. Assuming I want to be found, she muttered. There was a time not that long ago when I called you my vampire stalker. If I do this, then you'll be able to find me for what? A week? He shook his head. A month? Another shake. Longer? She asked, her expression strained. Forever, he said simply. Hollie leaned back against the sofa, staring at the ceiling. You're telling me that you'll always know where I am from just a tiny drop of blood? Always, no matter whether we've gone our separate ways? He nodded. It is part of the matehood bond. Our blood has complementary properties. Not only will I be able to tell where you are, but I'll know how you're feeling. If you're hurt, sad, lonely, needy. The thought of being able to feel his mate's arousal almost had him drooling, but he kept all of that to himself, not wanting to overwhelm her. It wasn't something he would be proud of after the fact, but at the moment, instinct was in control. This is insane, she said, clutching her head. I can't believe we're even sitting here debating this. We should be helping our friends. Your friends, he repeated, and it doesn't sound like they're going anywhere anytime soon. Cute, she said, glaring at him. Don't think I don't appreciate what you did for me back there, but remember, you're the one who got me into this. You're the reason Dallin kidnapped me, not once, but twice. You're the one who's been terrorizing me and my friends. You're the one who tried to bite me, is trying to convince me right now that I should let you taste me, for goodness sake. I think you owe me a little payback. I will help your friends, just as soon as you allow me to taste you. He stood his ground, even as his words wounded her. You don't know how right you are, Dumpling. If you were not my mate, you would not be in such danger. Greater danger than even you know. If Samael were to learn of your existence, perhaps I should refuse to let her leave regardless, he told himself. The risk of the angel of death discovering her was so great, and yet the need to know what she tasted like was overwhelming his good sense. You're a jerk, you know that, she said, crossing her arms over her chest. No wonder everyone hates vampires. Yes, I'm sure that's what they hate about us. His sardonic tone earned a begrudging smile from her, and his heart felt like it grew a size in that moment. Just a tiny taste, she said after a moment, her voice small. He nodded, moving closer to her. I promise that I will do everything within my power not to hurt you. And as soon as you're finished, you will take me to my friends and help break them out of robot jail? I swear it, he said, putting a hand over his heart. I can't believe I'm even considering this, she said, face turned up to the heavens. Any minute now, I'm going to wake up in some rubber room in an asylum somewhere because I started babbling about fairies in the middle of the grocery store and stabbing chopsticks into strawberries while raving about vampires. Maz hid his smile. He was on the verge of trembling, so excited was he by the prospect of what was about to happen. He could hear her speaking softly, a prayer that would have broken his heart if he'd had the ability to think about anything beyond the tiny pulse of blood in the vein of her neck. Hollie took a deep breath and moved the hair from her shoulder, exposing the long line of her throat. I'm trusting you now more than I've ever trusted another. Please don't break that trust. Her voice was soft, but he could feel the steel in it. Thank you for this trust. I will not break it. His fangs were growing longer, his mouth filling with saliva as he lowered it to the expanse of pale skin. Unable to help himself, he pressed a soft kiss to her neck before setting his fangs into place. As gently as he could, he pierced her skin, pausing long enough for the enzyme that dulled the pain to enter her bloodstream. The smallest droplet hit his tongue, and his restraint snapped. Maz pressed his fangs deep, moaning as the taste of her hit his tongue. His moan was answered by another, but he was too wrapped up in the sublime ecstasy that was her essence. It filled his senses in a way nothing else ever had or ever would. It was pure bliss, and he was instantly drunk on the blood of his mate. Another long draw, much more than the tiny taste he'd promised, flooded his mouth, and this time he heard her low, aching sound of need. He opened his eyes and peered into her face, eyes closed, Her features were painted with pleasure. He swallowed, then forced himself to pull away, retracting his fangs from her neck and licking the last traces of the sweetest elixir in the multiverse from his lips. Her eyes were dazed when they opened, but they soon filled with embarrassment. Hollie pushed him away, breathing heavily, her hand slapping over her neck where his mouth had just been. "You swore only to take a sip." "I did the best I could," he told her, hoping she would hear the sincerity in his voice. "I'm afraid tasting you proved to be quite exhilarating." "You should write ad campaigns for soft drinks," she said sardonically, and stood, starting to pace his sitting room. "So it's done then? You know where I am at all times now, like a helicopter parent who plants a GPS tracker in his kid's lunch pail?" "I will always sense where you are, yes, and what you are feeling and whether you are thinking of me." "Great," she said, hugging herself. Maz hid a frown. He could feel the wall between them rising again, and he was getting tired of scaling it. I had hoped that once she shared the experience of blood exchange together, she might feel differently. He had to remind himself that the exchange remained one-sided at the moment. She had yet to taste him, to feel the same euphoria that he was undergoing now. It was intense, the sensation of her blood mingling with his. He could sense her, sense the exact position she was standing in, even if he closed his eyes and left the room. Even if I were worlds away, I would know where she was. The feeling of security that filled him now was almost worth the deception of a mission he was perpetrating against her. "I won't think about that now," he told himself. "I can only hope that one day she will understand and forgive me." "Okay, now that that's done, what say we head back to Belafonte?" She was agitated and moody, and although he wanted nothing more than to pull her into his arms and comfort her, to tell her how wonderful she was and how much he cherished each moment they spent together, Maz knew that it wasn't what she wanted. He stood, pushing away his desire to enfold her to his chest, carry her into his bedchamber, and keep her there with him until time ground the multiverse to dust beneath its wheels. A part of him feared that fantasy would never come to pass, that it would always be like this between them, always an unscalable wall. "This is a worry for another time," he told himself. "Now it's time to hold up my end of the bargain." Chapter 16. "Come here, Wendy," Hollie called to the pot, knowing the little guy wouldn't be far. He discreetly excused himself during the little scene that had just taken place, and Hollie was grateful for it. She would have hated to know the robot had seen her lose herself in the vampire's bite. No wonder the women in those movies are always swooning over Dracula, she thought, her hand creeping to her neck again to feel the tiny puncture holes there. There was something so powerful and passionate about the way his fangs had felt inside her that it shook her to her core. Wendy Buckets rolled into the sitting room, for once his dome absent of cascading lights. "Stick close," she told him. "We're about to go back to the workshop."
"Are you certain that is the correct course of action?" he asked, catching her off guard.
"Oh, no, not you too, Wendy."
"Your vampire companion is right in his assessment that your current position is the most defensible. If this realm is undetectable, which my own testing seems to indicate, then your safest course of action would be to remain."
"That may be, but my friends need me, and humans don't abandon their friends. Robots shouldn't either."
"I don't have any friends," he replied, a few blue lights firing in his dome.
"Don't say that," she said, taking his little white hand in hers. "We're friends." He looked up at her, a rainbow of connections firing in his transparent head.
"Then I stand corrected. Your assessment is the most sound. One does not abandon one's friends."
Hollie smiled, and Maz let out a groan. "Okay, you two," he grumbled. "Hold on tight." A moment after his command, they found themselves once again in the storage closet in Gresh's workshop on Belafont. "Where do you think they've taken them?" Hollie asked Wendy, but before the robot could reply, Maz held up a hand. "I can hear a struggle, not far from here." He threw open the door, startling a small round robot that had been rolling down the corridor. It sagged out of the way and sped off to safety. "Careful, Maz," Hollie admonished him. "Better let Wendy help you navigate. This place is like a maze." She followed after the vampire as he set off down the hallway. "I can't hear anything," she thought, straining for any sign of a fight. Then again, I don't have vampire hearing. She watched his broad back as he hurried down the hall, Wendy accelerating to keep up with him. Her mind couldn't help replaying the exchange in his pocket realm,
the intimacy that they'd exchanged lingering in her body long after he'd let her go. She'd been blindsided by the whole experience. I've never felt anything like that. The intensity, the closeness, the melding of bodies and emotions. Hollie had expected it to hurt, despite Maz's promises to the contrary. Instead, it had been the most pleasurable experience of her life to date. I'd better not let Maz know that, she told herself. It would make her even more vulnerable to him than she already was. At the moment, it felt like the vampire held all the cards. She'd needed him to protect her, to help her friends, and in exchange, she'd given away her privacy. That thought poured cold water over the heated attraction she'd been feeling. He's got me tagged for the rest of eternity, and there's nothing I can do about it. Dark emotions flooding her, she turned her attention outward, forcing herself to focus on the task at hand. Wendy was advising the vampire on the layout of the building as they jogged, allowing Maz to make the correct turns to follow the sounds that only he could hear.
"This way,"
the robot called, making a sharp left turn into a dimly lit archway.
"This is a shortcut."
They followed the robot down a spiraling ramp that went down and down until Hollie figured that they must be underground. Halfway down the spiral, she picked up the sound of impacts, something crashing against something else. She hurried her steps, fear for her friends flooding her with adrenaline.
"They're in there,"
Wendy said when they reached a metal door that didn't open for them.
"Can you open it for us?"
Hollie asked, her nerves jangling when the robot didn't answer right away.
"Please, Wendy, my friends didn't do anything wrong."
Lights flashed, and at last the bot lifted its hand to the door.
"When this opens, be ready for a battle. The security units shoot first and ask questions never."
Maz nodded. "Understood." He stepped in front of Hollie, ready to shield her. "You two stay out of the way. I can't focus on the fight if I'm worried about something happening to you." Hollie nodded.
"You don't have to tell me twice. I'm not exactly fond of battles with killer robots myself."
"Security units,"
Wendy corrected. Then the door whooshed open. Hollie peeked around Maz's broad shoulders to see 4 identical humanoid robots, each equipped with shoulder weapons, which were pointed at the cage in the center of the room. The robots stood, each on one corner, observing the 3 females, who weren't happy to be behind bars.
"About leafing time!" Phaedra shouted. "What took you so long? Did you forget how to teleport, Leech?"
Maz didn't answer, but Hollie figured he was likely reevaluating whether he'd really gotten the better of the bargain between them. The moment the vampire crossed the threshold, 2 of the security units turned to aim their weapons at him.
"Halt! Do not enter! This is a restricted area!"
Maz ignored the robotic warnings, traveling to appear next to the nearest droid and punching him directly in the head. The robot's neck rocked back, a crack appearing in its faceplate. The blow had hurt it, but it wasn't down for the count. The weapon at its shoulder lit up, and a laser beam shot from it, headed straight for Maz. The vampire vanished just before it passed through the space where he'd been. Hollie held her breath, realizing that these bots might not be the easy win of other lesser life forms that Maz was accustomed to.
"Hey, security dink!" Phaedra shouted from the cage. "Why don't you come a little closer?" she said, motioning one closer to the cage. "I want to tell you something."
The droid looked at her, but didn't move. Phaedra let out a curse and went back to pacing, her eyes on the vampire.
"Why don't they use their magic?"
Hollie asked, confused. The cage didn't look like anything special, so how was it holding 3 very dangerous women?
"It's iron reinforced with a dampening field," Wendy said. "Sort of like a Faraday cage for magic."
"They can't use their powers?"
Hollie shook her head. She remembered how the Fae had been weakened by their iron chains on Aramanabad.
"Even the witch?"
"They aren't affected by the iron bars, but the dampening field is strong enough that she can't do much."
Cass was slumped against the bars, looking exhausted. Hollie knew the witch's brush with death earlier was likely to blame. The vampire was proving himself to be up to the task, however, as he hit upon a method that worked to fell the robots. He grabbed the closest one and positioned it so that he was standing between it and its fellow droid. When the robot fired at him, he teleported at the last second so that the laser beam hit the other droid, disabling it. After taking down 3 bots, he ripped the weapon off the shoulder of the last and pointed it at the droid, aiming right between its round eyes.
"Lights out!" he growled,
then fired, dropping the lifeless scrap and dusting off his hands. Wendy made a series of beeps, and Hollie knew the bot was likely upset.
"I'm sorry you had to see that," she said, crouching beside him.
"I am not,"
he said after a moment.
Security units are jerks.
Hollie let out a burst of laughter. Okay, then. She straightened, patting the little bot on the head. Can you help us open the cage and let out my friends?
Affirmative.
Wendy rolled forward and Hollie followed, watching as the little machine worked the lock until the door swung open. Phaedra made a beeline for the vampire, and Hollie managed to grab her arm before she reached him. I know you're upset, Hollie said gruffly, but if we could please hold all revenge plots until we're able to escape without alerting any more security units to our presence. It's a little late for that, a voice called from the doorway. Hollie's head turned to find Dallin scowling at her, Gresh beside him, with what looked like a remote control in his hand. Let's make sure they don't leave this room, the imp suggested, and Gresh nodded, hitting a button on his device. The door slid shut, an extra layer of metal as thick as a finger coming down the wall to cover it. Dallin strolled closer to the cage, where the rest of them was still assembled. I see you figured out where I was, the imp said, his eyes on Maz. What gave it away? The fact that you attempted to abduct my mate and thought I would not come for her no matter where you took her? The vampire's eyes changed, flashing red as he stared at Dallin in rage. Why are we wasting time on these acorn hoarders? Phaedra said, lunging toward the imp with her sword drawn. Dallin teleported, appearing behind the technomage. Why don't you show them why they're never going to leave here? The imp told his companion. Hollie watched nervously as the old man pressed another button, and a whirring sound filled the room. She looked up to see the ceiling sliding open, and an axle filled with rotating blades began to lower itself into the chamber.
That all you have?
Phaedra said, looking unimpressed.
You got this, Taylor? I sure do,
the other Fae replied, flapping her wings to fly up to meet the blades. Snowflakes shot from her fingertips as a sheet of ice started to cover the whirring blades, slowing them down until they lay frozen, unable to spin.
What else you got for us?
Phaedra said, and Cass elbowed her. The witch was tired and not afraid to let them know. Enough of these endless villains and their goons, she grumbled. Can we just take these guys down already so I can go home and get some rest?
Your wish is my command,
Phaedra said, then pressed her hands to the ground, making the floor beneath their feet start to tremble. Hollie had been with the Fae long enough to expect vines and roots to burst from the ground beneath them, but instead the floor stopped rumbling and went still again.
You pesky magic users always think there are no defenses to your little spells.
Gresh took a few steps to the center of the room.
But you seem to forget that this is my workshop.
He pressed a button on his device, smiling widely. Phaedra and Taylor let out twin screeches and fell to the ground, covering their ears as tears started to stream down their cheeks. Maz's face was a rictus of pain as well, and Hollie could see a trickle of blood start to seep from one ear. Hollie could hear nothing, but it seemed she was the only one. Stop it! She shouted, rushing toward the technomage. Oh, no, you don't, Dallin said, intercepting her. You know we're nearly late for our little rendezvous. He clamped a hand around her arm. Let's go. No, Hollie shouted, but she knew her protest was in vain when she felt the ground whoosh away from her. The last sound she heard before the blackness swallowed her was the anguished howl of the vampire. Chapter 17. The imp was still grumbling when they arrived at their destination. Hollie's eyes took a moment to adjust to the gloom, the world around them bathed in darkness after their sudden departure from Gresh's workshop. Anger boiled up inside her, as well as frustration and fright, and she debated wheeling over and sucking her abductor in the mouth. Not again! Every time she seemed to get anywhere, Dallin came along and messed things up. This was the third time the imp had dragged her off-world for his own selfish scheme. She was tired of going along out of fear. She took a step forward, then froze, looking down to find a familiar translucent dome pointed back at her. Wendy had managed to tag along again, his protocol still driving him to latch on to Hollie and follow her everywhere. Relief that she wasn't alone with the imp helped mitigate some of the anger she felt. That is, until her captor spoke again. Let's get a move on, Dallin said. He was little more than a darker shape against an already dark background. Ahriman doesn't suffer tardiness.
Ahriman doesn't suffer tardiness, she mocked in a smarmy tone. You know what? I really don't care what Ahriman likes and doesn't like.
The imp shook his head. That attitude is going to change quick once you're back on Ahriman Abad. Until then, don't expect me to be a cheerleader for my own demise, she said, her chin jutting out in defiance. You're going to regret this ridiculous plan once you end up betrayed yourself. Then we'll see how you feel. Less talking, more walking, Dallin said, then set off down the small hill they were standing on. When Hollie didn't move to follow, he sighed, teleported behind her, and gave her a shove. It was slow going since Hollie couldn't see where she was stepping. Wendy seemed to sense the issue and assisted, a small light appearing from a chamber in his metal torso. It provided enough illumination for her to see the path beneath her feet. Would it have killed you to bring a lantern? She griped at the imp. She saw him shrug his shoulders. I can see in the dark. As they walked, he indicated the sweeping vista before them. Creatures with night vision are better off on Nyx, also known as the Land of Night. His hand swept across the sky above them. There is no sun on Nyx, only 3 moons. Hollie followed the direction of his gesture, taking in an ink-black sky devoid of stars. 3 celestial bodies hung in the firmament above them, all moons in varying stages of fullness. She shivered, something about the sky freaking her out. Gee, I wonder why I'm not exactly feeling my greatest. Maybe it's a lightless world, or the fact that I'm about to be traded to some evil prince to be locked away for the rest of my days. In the distance, a series of bone-white ruins seemed to gleam with a light of their own. Tumbled columns and steps that no longer led to anywhere put her in mind of a photograph she'd once seen of the Roman Forum. A bustling city center 2,000 years ago, the marble rooms were now only reminders of their former glory, and the ruins of Nyx had much the same vibe. Whatever they'd been used for in the past, those times were long gone. They were much closer before she could make out the figure standing on a raised dais surrounded by intact columns near the center of the ruins. The imp picked up his pace, racing toward the dais, an ingratiating expression on his face. He gripped Hollie's arm and pulled her forward, barreling up the steps. Dallin made a wide bow, then shoved Hollie to her knees in front of their appointment. She went down hard, a knock of pain pulsing from her knees. Gritting her teeth, she looked up at the imposing figure towering over her. She'd gotten a glimpse of the Prince of Darkness during his call with the imp in Gresh's workshop, but seeing him in person, she was struck by a powerful animal magnetism radiating from him. He was regal in bearing, his angular face and strong jaw reminding her of a hero on the cover of a historical romance novel. She could easily see him under a Jolly Roger, white shirt open to the waist, exposing a muscular chest, damsels swooning in his oversized arms. Ahriman looked her over, his gaze piercing. "This is Mazik's mate, eh?" His expression said he was skeptical. "And yet there is no sign of the vampire. How did you manage to spirit away his mate without him raining hell down upon you?" Dallin straightened, a smug smile on his face. "I've given the leech the slip on several occasions," he said, his demeanor like a kid who thought he was too cool for school. "He won't trouble us." "That's what you think. Just wait until he shows up to rescue me and wipes that self-satisfied expression off your face." Hollie no longer wondered whether the vampire would come for her. She knew it was just a question of when, especially after the bite he'd given her. "I guess this is our test run to see if my blood actually did the trick." It was surprising, the shift that had taken place inside her. For so long she'd thought about nothing but escaping the fanged creature that seemed obsessed with terrorizing her, hoping that Cass's ritual would rid her of the vamp permanently. But now she was starting to wonder what her life would look like without the handsome Maz always around. Ahriman continued to question the imp, wanting assurances that Hollie was what he said she was. "What proof have you that this human belongs to Mazik?" "I was there when he first saw her. He'd been sent to bring me back after another one of my escape attempts. The moment he noticed her, his entire attention was on the human. He'd had me cornered, and with her as a distraction, I was able to escape him. You know how single-minded that one is, but when she's around, the human is all he thinks about." Hollie had heard similar things about vampires and their mates from others, but hearing Dallin lay it out like this had her insides icing over. Knowing that she was the object of obsession made her feel ill.
Isn't this kind of relationship the definition of toxic? Ahriman listened as the imp went on to recount a portion of their adventures, emphasizing how Maz was always searching for Hollie, always attempting to return to her side. The prince eyed her during the recitation, and she didn't like the way his gaze made her skin start to crawl. After several moments, the prince raised his hand to cut off the flow of Dallin's words. "You're telling me that the vampire had multiple opportunities to claim his mate, and yet here she is, helpless and unguarded." His words rankled, and Hollie had half a mind to kick him in the shin just to prove that she wasn't entirely helpless, but she knew it would do little good. The guy probably wouldn't even feel it any more than I noticed the buzzing of a gnat. By far the more annoying issue was the fact that these men were discussing her love life like a pair of farmers might talk about a bull and his cow. Dallin nodded. "I can't tell you why, other than she's got a few friends who managed to keep Maz busy. I've had a difficult time keeping a grip on her as well." "Friends?" the prince asked, his expression hardening. "What sort of friends would a human have that could trouble an imp or a vampire?" "Magical ones," Dallin explained. "A pair of Fae, one especially ruthless and a witch with a knack for getting them out of scrapes." The prince's eyes widened. He turned his gaze to her again. "The vampire's mate is friends with Fae. That is interesting." Hollie yawned, not bothering to hide her boredom with the conversation. "They aren't talking to me. They're talking about me, deciding my fate without so much as an opinion from me. This is the opposite of interesting." "If she is unclaimed as you state, then I will agree to a trade," the prince said at last. She didn't bother to gauge Dallin's expression because she knew the imp would be celebrating his victory. When Ahriman turned his gaze in her direction, she met it without fear. "Tell me, little human," he said, looking down at her, "how does it feel to be the mate of a monster?" Feeling sassy, Hollie said the first thing that popped into her mind. "Why don't you ask your wife?" Dallin hissed, but Ahriman burst out in laughter. "I like spirit in a female," he told her, his grin making him even more striking. "That spirit will serve you well. It is not easy being a vampire's mate, especially for a human. They're so fragile, not at all like their supernaturally strong and immortal mates." He crouched beside her, his face level with hers. "Tell me, little human, would you be willing to give up your old life, to give up ever seeing the sun again, to be turned and face an existence gorging yourself on blood? Because that is what it takes to be a vampire's mate." "I gotta be honest with you," she answered truthfully. "None of that sounds particularly appealing." Ahriman laughed again. "Then it is a good thing that I've taken a liking to you. You shall be a fine addition to my collection. You will not have to worry about being tied to a leech for eternity." What he didn't say was what she'd be subjected to as a part of his famed collection. "It doesn't matter," she told herself, "because it won't happen. Maz will come for me." She was in full denial of what was happening, considering herself just biding time until the vamp appeared to take her away from this mess. The imp brought Ahriman's attention back to himself. "Now that we have a deal, how about breaking this unbreakable bond and severing my connection to your hateful brother?" "That was our bargain, wasn't it?" Ahriman said, his face impassive. "It was," Dallin said, shifting his weight from one foot to the other in his impatience. "I'm eager to be free." "Indeed you are." There was something about the prince's voice that raised Hollie's hackles. Ahriman took a step in Dallin's direction, a fierce look in his eyes. She held her breath, unsure of what would happen next. The ground started to rumble, and at first Hollie thought it was part of the deal, part of the bond being broken, but she caught a look of surprise on the prince's face. The ground underneath her knees started to crack, and Hollie skittered backwards, bracing herself at the base of one of the columns, Wendy joining her. His arms extended and wrapped themselves around the column, holding on for dear life. The cracks expanded, the ground shaking like a strong earthquake. The ruins around her started to cave in on themselves, and she was certain they were all about to be pulled down into darkness when a sinkhole opened and swallowed the whole group. Instead, A burst of heat blasted from the largest crack in the center of the dais. From the depths emerged a monstrous figure enveloped by broad wings of black smoke. The wings opened, revealing a corpse-like creature, all bones and rotting skin, towering over them, his skeletal grin full of menace. Hollie folded in on herself, fear filling her bloodstream with adrenaline. The massive undead creature let out a shriek like she imagined would come from a banshee, robbing her body of breath. She closed her eyes and prayed, certain that she'd finally encountered a situation she couldn't escape from. Chapter 18. The next sound she could make out made her shake her head, wondering if she'd heard what she thought she had. No, that's definitely a slow clap. The applause picked up speed, and Hollie's eyes shot to the prince, whose face showed how unimpressed he was by the new arrival. "Bravo, brother!" The hulking wings of smoke began to dissipate, the figure shrinking in on itself rapidly. The hanging strips of decaying skin knitted themselves back together to cover the exposed bone, and a few moments later a pleasantly handsome male stepped past the crack on the dais, wafting away a stray streak of remaining smoke before taking a mock bow. "You always did know how to make an entrance," Ahriman told him by way of greeting. The stranger picked a piece of debris off his tailored suit and smiled. He cut an attractive figure, slender but strong, with chiseled features and carefully mussed platinum blonde hair. "To what do we owe this visit?" the prince asked in a neutral tone. Dallin, meanwhile, was less than ecstatic to see the gentleman. He'd moved to the edge of the dais when the rumbles had started, and now he was inching closer to Hollie, his eyes fastened on the new arrival. Fright made her tremble. If the imp is worried, I should be terrified. "It's the angel of death," Dallin whispered in her ear when he reached her side. "Samael himself. I don't know how he knew we would be here." "It seems like the imp's secret is no secret after all," Ahriman said when Samael reached him. "You clearly already know that your pet leech has a mate." Samael ignored the question, his demeanor brusque. "I have information that I know you'll want to hear, brother." Ahriman's face wore a closed expression. "I know any information from you will come at a hefty price, but whether that price is worth paying remains to be seen. What is it you want in exchange?" "It's a small thing, something you won't miss." He turned, and for the first time Hollie saw that his eyes were disturbing, the pupils red like a deep merlot, or blood, just like blood. She trembled under the weight of his gaze, knowing that even Maz himself was afraid of the angel of death. "I want the human female." Dallin let out a strangled sound and shot to his feet. "That isn't fair! We had a bargain, Ahriman and I. You can't come along and scoop up the prize after the deal has been done." "I know all about your deal, imp," Samael said dismissively, "and I'll offer you the same one. Give me the human, and I'll release you from your bonds." The imp froze, his eyes narrowed, his expression unconvinced. "I know better than to trust you. You don't have a habit of keeping your word." Samael put a hand on his chest, a pained expression on his face. "Oh, Dallin, you wound me." Hollie could tell that it was all for show, that Samael gave no thought to the imp's opinion of him. She didn't blame Dallin for being suspicious. Ahriman crossed his arms over his chest. "This is highly irregular," he said stiffly, reminding Hollie of some aristocrat complaining to his servants about a late Sunday supper. "Would you care to tell me why you've barged in here intending to steal my newest acquisition?" A thread of temper showed itself on Samael's face. "The entire multiverse does not revolve around your blasted collection, brother. There are more important things to worry about. Says the man who spends every waking hour sticking his metaphorical hand up the backside of a multitude of minions to use them like puppets, carrying out your obscure machinations." Ahriman's brows lowered, his tone stiff. Hollie could tell that there was little love lost between the brothers. I suppose princes are just like everyone else when it comes to sibling rivalries. "At least my actions have effects. You're basically still playing with dolls." Samael gave his brother a sharp smile to match his cutting barb. I knew there was a reason I no longer invited you over for dinner, Ahriman said in a superior tone. You're too busy cutting into everyone else's plates instead of minding your own. You always were too greedy for your own good. How big is your collection again? Samael mused, stroking his chin. I heard you recently added an addition to your palace complex that is larger than the original bunker you started with all those millennia ago. All for your collection of dollies. Hollie was beginning to feel as if she were watching a tennis match. The brothers lobbed insult after insult at one another, and as they talked, her anxiety ebbed. In the last several hours, she'd been tortured, kidnapped twice, and bitten by a vampire. At a certain point, one reaches their maximum level of terror, and the longer they undergo it, the less it affects them. She was becoming desensitized to the chaos. Yawning again, she started to consider slinking off to find a place to catch a nap. It seemed something was holding up a rescue from Maz, but her confidence wasn't wavering. He'd get her eventually. What's the rush? She thought. It sounds like these guys can go on all night trading insults. I haven't seen anything like this since middle school. She sat down heavily on the dais step, stretching out her legs and letting out a sigh of relief. It felt like she'd been crouching for ages. Her gaze scanned the ruins around her, and she wondered idly at her chances of finding an old cushion to lie down on. Enough! She heard Samael roar, the word echoing over the ruined city and to the foothills beyond. Despite what you may think of me, dear brother, he said, his once cool tone now overheated, I came here in good faith with information to share. Sharing implies that you're giving it away, Ahriman pointed out. But you want something in exchange, something for which demand has recently increased. You'll see why I can't let you have her for your collection. This is more important than some underling's girlfriend. Then tell us, Ahriman said, his expression hearty, as if he were just waiting for the next opportunity to roast his sibling. What is this all-important information that you think is going to make me give up this bidding war that I'm engaging in purely to spite you? Have you spoken to our sister lately? Samael's question hung in the air between them. Hollie noticed the color draining out of the other prince's face. Ahriman looked like he'd swallowed something that disagreed with him. Our sister? Why would you ask me that? This human female is tied up in something having to do with our sister. How long has it been since we've even heard rumblings of her presence, let alone caught a glimpse of her? Samael's expression was serious, his eyes glowing with intensity. I don't believe it, Ahriman said, his temper fully visible on his face. This is just another one of your deceptions, one of your tricks. I saw her with my own eyes, brother. Samael's voice was soft, but filled with intensity. She is back. Prove it, Ahriman snarled. You saw her. Where? When were you in the same room with her? I wasn't, Samael admitted, then pointed at Hollie. But she was. Ahriman's golden eyes swung in her direction. What would our sister want with a human? He shook his head. It doesn't make sense. He turned back to Samael. You said you saw her with your own eyes. How could you accomplish that without being in the same room with her? Let's say I caught her reflection, he replied, hurrying past the point. The fact remains, the human is tangled up in our sister's dealings, and for that reason, she cannot become a part of your little menagerie. Nevroyel wants the human, Ahriman said, his tone indicating that he was talking to himself as much as them. She's come out of hiding for the girl, and yet here she is, alive and well. His expression clouded. Perhaps the human is a trap. Hollie's eyes widened, but she held her tongue. What do they think, that someone stuck a bomb inside me? Nevroyel was never one to do her business out in the open, Samael reminded his brother. She prefers the shadows, speaking in whispers, remaining unseen. Nevroyel, Hollie thought after hearing the name a second time and turning it over in her mind. They couldn't be talking about Nev, could they? Suddenly the pieces fell into place. The way the dark lady had sought out Ahriman, the way she'd called him brother. Despite what Maz thought he knew to be true, It seemed there was a princess of darkness after all. Perhaps this is all the more reason to place her in my collection, for safekeeping. Armand floated the idea, but Samael was quick to shoot it down. The argument began anew between them, and Hollie rolled her eyes, exhausted by the back and forth. She stood, stretching her limbs, then started down the steps. "Where do you think you're going?" Dallin hissed at her, her face a mask of anxiety. "It sounds like they're going to be at it for a while," she replied, not bothering to turn back. "I'm going to find a place to take a nap. Wake me up when they decide which one of them gets to keep me, or when Maz comes to rescue me at last." She half expected Dallin to follow her, to bring her back to the dais and the interminable argument, but he let her go, and soon she was walking through a dilapidated archway and into a small stone chamber that was missing its roof.
"It seems comfortable resting places are in short supply," Wendy said from a few paces behind her. "Perhaps we could find some soft grasses on the outskirts, enough to make a passable bed for you to sleep."
She smiled at the pot, appreciating his concern. "I'll just prop myself up against a wall if I have to. I doubt wherever the prince who wins me decides to take me will be any more comfortable than this dump." There was a crumbled wall with a hole large enough to walk through in the far wall. She stepped through, then went around the corner, hoping for a space that was clear of debris. Hollie had almost made it through another doorway when a faint blue glow floated out of the wall beside her. "Hey, kiddo," a gruff voice said close to her ear. Hollie's heart stopped. She froze, turning to take in the floating image of a familiar figure who was smiling at her. "Dad?" Chapter 19. I must be more exhausted than I thought. Hollie blinked several times, but the blue glowing figure remained. "That's right," her father said, floating closer. "It's so good to see you. It's been too long." Tears sprang to her eyes, and Hollie's knees went weak. Resting her back against a wall, she slid down it, landing on her bottom and still staring up at the phantom figure. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same question, young lady. It seems like you've taken up with a tough crowd since I saw you last." He jerked his spectral thumb back in the direction of the dais. "Who are those guys, and why are they fighting over my little girl?" "It's a long story," she admitted. "Sure you have time to hear it?" "I always have time for you," he said simply. The glowing blue image crossed its legs and floated an inch from the floor in front of her. "Gosh, I sure have missed you, kiddo." "I've missed you too, Dad," she told him, her voice breaking. Before she knew it, she was sobbing. She leaned forward, hoping to fall into her father's arms, but instead she fell through him, landing hard against the dusty stone floor. She rolled over and looked up at him. Her father's face was filled with concern. He reached down to wipe at her tears, but his fingers seemed to go through her. She couldn't feel his touch, which made her sob all the harder. "It's okay, sweetheart," her father said softly. "Please don't cry." It took some time for her tears to taper off, but Hollie finally caught her breath. Pulling herself back into a sitting position, she shook her head in confusion. "How is this happening? You're dead." She didn't want to say the word, didn't want to give voice to one of the most terrible truths of her life. But the fact remained, her father was dead and buried. There was no way he could be here as alive as he had been, minus the corporeal form.
"It is a strange property of this realm."
It was Wendy who spoke, filling her in.
"It is a phenomenon known only to Nyx, the reconstitution of deceased persons who'd been a part of the visitor's life. Grash has theorized that it has something to do with the residual energy that is discharged when a person dies. The atmosphere of this realm somehow channels that energy to animate the deceased's shade."
Hollie was so shocked by the appearance of her dead father that she wasn't comprehending what Wendy was telling her. "Are you saying this realm is some sort of afterlife? Souls go here when they die?" Her throat tightened as she looked around the land of night and its bleak landscape. "You're telling me my father is in hell?"
"No, indeed. Philosophers and scientists have not yet agreed on the reality of an afterlife, as you call it, but what they can agree on is that Nyx is more of a ghost world, to borrow from primitive superstitions."
Wendy gestured toward the glowing blue version of her father that was currently looking at the bot with amusement. "Is it some kind of toy?" he asked her, cocking his head. "It's pretty advanced, isn't it? Does it run on double D batteries?" Wendy made a series of offended beeps.
A toy?
Holly hid a smile and patted the bot on the shoulder affectionately. "He's not a toy, Dad. He is a sophisticated thinking machine, a senior floor manager, in fact, in a prestigious scientific workshop." Pink lights cascaded in Wendy's dome, and Holly knew he was pleased. Her father looked puzzled for a moment, but his affability soon returned. "Frank Townsend," he told Wendy by way of introduction. "Pleasure to meet you."
"Wendy Buckets," the bot replied. "As I was saying, this world isn't so much like a version of Earth's heaven or hell, or any other realm's mythological afterlife. Not an entirely understood condition of this planet allows for it to broadcast the memories of a person who has been lost from a visitor's brain, creating this sort of spectral version of the deceased. It's merely a projection, insubstantial and short-lived."
Her chest felt tight. How short-lived? Although it felt strange to see her father again, knowing that he was dead, she wasn't eager to lose him again.
"When you depart, so will the shade,"
the bot replied simply.
"There is a reason so few choose to visit Nyx. For one, the deceased person that appears to haunt you might not be the one that you'd like to see. You don't get to pick and choose. Not to mention the whole idea of being haunted isn't something that most people look forward to."
She couldn't help but think he was leaving out the worst reason folks avoided the realm. You might be reunited with the person you miss most, but what happens when it's time to go? You'd essentially be killing them again, making it virtually impossible to want to say goodbye. Holly pushed that thought from her mind, knowing that she had no say in when she'd leave, just as she hadn't had a say in her arrival here. She turned to her father, forcing herself to smile through the pain. "It sure is good to see you again, Dad." "You can say that again," he replied, with his customary goofy smile that made her heart ache. "How have you been, kiddo? Keeping busy at the office?" She didn't have the heart to tell him about their declining customer base or her desire to close up shop altogether. "The business is going well. Everything is pretty much the same as you left it." "Well, that's a shame," he said, surprising her. "What do you mean, Dad? I thought you'd want me to carry on." "If that's what makes you happy," he said. "But the business is yours now. It's all yours. You should change whatever you want. You don't need to keep things preserved like a museum to an old man who cared more about fishing than premiums." The way he looked at her penetrated her feeble defenses, and the tears started to come again, as much as she didn't want to turn their exchange into a pity party. "It's been hard going on without you," she admitted. "I miss you so much, and walking around the office or at home, I feel like any minute you're going to come around the corner and make some lame joke and everything will be like it was. Instead, everything seems so empty." "Oh, sweetheart," he said, moving forward to embrace her, but instead floating right through her. With a confused expression, he came back to stand beside her. "I didn't want to leave you, you know." "I know," she said with a watery sniff. "I just miss you." "Well, I'm here now," he said, his tone soft but jovial. "Let's catch up while we have a chance. Did the Packers make it to the playoffs this year?" "Asking the most important questions first, eh?" she said, laughing. Her father started to chuckle, and soon they were both rolling around, suffering under an uncontrollable bout of the giggles. When the laughter subsided, Frank asked how the town was doing. "Is Potomac any different without me?" he asked jokingly. Holly's smile slipped. "It's lonelier," she said honestly, feeling the tears return to her eyes. She felt like she'd cried enough to fill the lake they'd fish in each year at his funeral. But she was realizing now that grief doesn't have an expiration date. "To be honest, I've been thinking about pulling up stakes and moving on. Maybe to Chicago or Milwaukee." "The big city, eh?" he replied in a hushed tone. "You should do it." "I'm sorry," she said with a watery smile. "I shouldn't have said that.
It's just hard to stick around the same old places and not be haunted by your ghost. Aren't we pesky ghosts annoying? You think you get rid of us by heading off to an exotic locale? Her father threw out his arms to indicate the nighttime world around them. And yet here I am, still haunting you. That isn't what I meant, Hollie started, afraid she'd offended her father. I know it isn't, honey. I don't want to be the thing that's haunting you, but even more, I never wanted to hold you back from living your life. You used to talk about going away to college, about moving away, and I realize now that I discouraged it, even without saying anything. I was being selfish, wanting to keep you around for as long as I could. That isn't what a parent should do. A parent should want his child to live her best life, with or without him. Dad, I love you, she said in a weepy voice. And I wouldn't trade any of the time we had together for anything. Not even a shiny metal robot? He asked, gesturing to Wendy, who was holding out a handkerchief that he must have pulled out of somewhere. Hollie laughed. I don't know. Mr. Buckets here sure comes in handy. Her father joined her this time when she laughed. Some of the pain she felt at seeing her father again was starting to fade, replaced by the sheer joy of being around him. There was a rumble from the dais and the sound of raised voices, but Hollie ignored them. She'd fought hard for the little bit of peace she was experiencing here with her father, and she wasn't going to give it up just because two overgrown boys couldn't agree on who got to keep the toy they both wanted. They talked about Watoma, about their clients and neighbors, about the annual pancake breakfast at the Elks Lodge, whether Hollie had taken part in the usual summer rummage sale this year, or if the old drive-in theater on Route 12 had finally shut its doors or not. Actually, they got started replaying the first feature over again after the second, Hollie told them. And Old Man Withers is experimenting with nutritional yeast on the popcorn. I guess you can teach old dogs new tricks, Frank said, shaking his head. Well, wonders never cease. As much as she tried to banish it, in the back of her mind, the fact that her father's ghost would disappear when she departed from Nick's kept creeping back into her thoughts. It felt too good, talking with him again, and she knew she'd suffer when she'd lose him all over again. It just didn't seem fair. Then again, nothing about life is fair. It was a lesson she'd learned when her mother passed years ago. It was a lesson life had continued to teach her as she was dragged from realm to realm and prince to prince. Maybe there is a way I can stay here, she said to herself. A way to keep my father alive. It was an unsettling thought, especially given their previous situation, but she couldn't bear to think that she would be the one who was condemning him to the void. I won't leave, she told herself. No matter who tries to claim me, I'll stay here until the 3 moons fall out of the sky. My father and me, partners in crime until the world stops turning. All of her bluster did little to alleviate the ache in her chest. Chapter 20. Release me! The vampire bolted upright, claws out, fangs exposed, ready to rend and tear, to bite and destroy. Anything to keep his mate safe. Except there was nothing holding him. He blinked into the dimness, noticing a trio of unhappy faces around him. Do you wake up like that every morning? Phaedra asked him through pursed lips. You must go through a fortune in sheets. They were in the shade of a massive tree, and you could see purple twilight through the spaces between the leaves. Where are we? He asked, certain they were no longer in the workshop on Bellefonte. The Fae realm, Cass admitted. I had little time to make a portal for our escape, and this was the first place that popped into my mind. Where's Hollie? He rubbed his head, then winced at a sore spot he'd touched. They'd been fighting the technomage and his contraptions when something had hit him on the head, knocking him out cold. For the second time in as many days. Perhaps I should start wearing a helmet. We don't know, Taylor answered his question. We were all caught up in the fight against those horrible little murder balls, and by the time we destroyed all of them and waylaid the old man, Hollie was gone, the imp along with her. What? How could you let that happen? Maz roared, leaping to his feet. He could sense her then inside himself, thanks to the blood connection they now shared. But she was very far away, and the impressions he was getting from her were muffled due to the distance. At least I know she's still alive. All she has to do is stay that way until I find her."
"It wasn't like we had much choice," Phaedra grumbled. "We barely managed to make it out of the workshop alive ourselves. Gresh is a powerful techno-mage, and none of us have taken on his sort of tech before, not to mention we were fighting him on his home turf. Once we realized Hollie was gone, we escaped as quickly as we could," Taylor supplied. "We figured we needed a safe space to figure out our next steps, perhaps collect some allies. We already know at least one Prince of Darkness is involved in this. It couldn't hurt to have more folks to watch our backs."
"Gather a whole army if you like," Maz grunted. "But I'm going after Hollie now." He focused on her location, sensing it without knowing exactly where in the multiverse she was. Maz knew he could travel blind when it came to his mate, something he'd never done before. Traveling usually required a location fixed in his mind prior to teleporting, but this time he'd go on faith and his connection to his mate. Except nothing happened. He tried again, and again he remained exactly where he was. "What in the 17 hells is going on here?"
"They sort of insisted," Taylor said with a sheepish grin. "I told them you wouldn't be pleased."
"Them who? What are you talking about?" Maz tried repeatedly to travel away, but he was blocked over and over. Magical means were keeping him in his spot. "Someone better explain before I start dragging answers out of you the hard way."
"He's worse than Hollie made him out to be," a familiar voice said, and Maz turned his head to see two identical-looking women walk into the shade of the tree. He knew the women, had seen Hollie with them before. Recognizing the scent of the one who'd spoken, he remembered catching her in the rough and demanding she lead him to his mate. It all felt like a very long time ago now.
"You'll have to forgive him," Taylor said. "He's a little out of sorts when Hollie isn't around, but he's not as bad as he seems."
"Are you the one who is doing this to me?" he growled at her. "Release me at once, or face my wrath."
"Oh, face my wrath," the woman repeated. "I have honest-to-goodness goosebumps. Feel my arm." She held out her arm to her sister, who pushed it away.
"You shouldn't be so rude to our guest, Gilly,"
her twin said. She turned to address the vampire. "I'm afraid we're just taking precautions. The last time we met, things didn't go so well, so you'll have to forgive us."
"Release me," he repeated, his tone dripping with menace.
"See, Lena," Gilly told her sister, "he's no better than a mad dog roaming the streets, looking for something to bite."
"Hush,"
Lena scolded her sister before giving Maz an awkward smile.
"I don't have the power to release you. My mother Elspeth, Queen of the Fae Realm, is the one who is shielding you. You're in the sacred grove located at the center of the Fae Royal Palace. My mother controls everything here."
"Fae?" Maz spit, less than enthusiastic that he'd been thrust among even more interfering females who didn't want him to end up with Hollie. "I should have known you'd gang up on me, that you'd try to keep her from me."
"Can you blame us?" Gilly barked. "You've done nothing but stalk and terrify the poor girl since you first saw her. In my book, you're the criminal."
"And I suppose that makes you the jailer?" he told her, his tone deadly serious.
"I've been called worse," she replied with a sniff.
"I can see that we're getting off on the wrong foot here,"
Taylor cut in, putting herself between the vampire and wildling.
"May I remind everyone that we are all here out of our concern for Hollie. We must work together for her sake."
His impatience to locate his mate was eating him up inside. Instinct would not allow him to talk calmly. No matter how much his rational side preached caution.
"Release me now, or you will regret it!"
There was a sound of rustling leaves that Maz assumed was caused by a flock of birds, startled by his shouting. He was mistaken, however. When the rustling gave way to two figures, one tall and lean, the other broad and exceedingly muscular, he recognized the pair as belonging to the Fae twins.
"What's all this commotion?"
the larger one asked, cracking the knuckles on his sizable fist. The other, an ethereal-looking Fae, had his rapier pointed straight in Maz's direction. He didn't speak, but his look said volumes.
"Our guest was just telling us that he's going to cooperate to the fullest of his abilities,"
Gilly said sharply. Her sister let out a sigh, putting her face in her hands.
"I would like to once again put forth that we're here for Hollie, not for petty rivalries or preconceived notions," Taylor counseled.
"Like the fact that leeches aren't welcome here,"
the female said, scowling in Maz's direction.
"You aren't helping, Bracken,"
Lena groaned, then put a hand on his arm, pushing it down so he lowered his rapier.
"This is more complicated than it looks."
"What is more complicated?" the copper-skinned brute asked.
Deciding whether to stake the leech or leave him out and let the sun do the job for us? Maz hissed, his claws lengthening. He'd made short work of the other dev he'd gone up against. He was confident that he could put this one in his place if need be. All right, enough, Phaedra said at last. Everyone here knows that I more than anyone hate a leech, but at this time, I'm inclined to side with Lena. The situation is complicated. This person helped us out of a scrape, Taylor continued. We've teamed up to rescue Hollie, and the way I see it, the job isn't yet finished. Where is Hollie? Lena asked, her voice laced with concern. We don't know, Cass admitted. We believe the imp has her. I know where she is, Maz said, which is why you will remove your shield from me and let me go to her. If you know where she is, then tell us, Phaedra insisted. We'll help you bring her back. I cannot pinpoint her on a map, Maz grumbled, but I can sense her. You drank from her! The color drained from the witch's face, her hands trembling. I can't believe it, but you bit her, didn't you? All eyes were on Maz. So, what if I did? He said defiantly. She is my mate. You acorn-stealing bastard, Phaedra said through gritted teeth, then pulled her sword from her back, ready to run him through. I was not about to let her rush off again, knowing that she's been hidden from me before. I insisted that if we were to return and help you escape from Gresh's robots, I would need to be able to find her. Consider this a built-in tracking system. His clever turn of vocabulary impressed no one. Taylor shook her head, her face full of disappointment. You coerced her. You used our captivity as leverage to convince her to let you drink her. Gasp went up around the circle, and Maz's insides burned with shame. I did what I had to, he said gruffly. I will not be separated from my mate. And yet, look at you now. This from a new voice. Maz turned his head to take in the regal red-headed female Fae, who stepped under the shade of the tree. She was followed by an equally stately male with long white blonde hair and a serious face. Your mate is nowhere to be seen. Mother, Lena said gently, bowing her head. Our guest knows of Hollie's whereabouts, but he's having a little trouble sharing them. What a pity, the regal one replied, her tone saying it was anything but. Perhaps he could use some persuading. Say the word, Your Majesty, the one called Bracken said, lifting his rapier once more. Maz's eyes returned to the redhead. You are the ruler of this realm? You are in the presence of Elsbeth, Queen of the Fae Realm, the male beside her said, his tone stern. She does not suffer fools or liars. Release me, Maz said, ignoring the male. Free me and I will go to her. I don't take orders from leeches, the Queen said, her expression feral. She had an air that told the vampire she wasn't someone to be trifled with. Anger boiling, he tried again to travel, but nothing happened. I could try to fight my way out, he thought, but the time he'd spent with the females who had brought him here had soured him on directing violence toward them. Besides, they'd dragged my unconscious body back here when they could have left me to Gresh and his killer robots. Your Majesty, he said, moving toward her only to drop to his knees. He pulled open his heavy coat and ripped at his shirt, exposing the skin above his heart. You can rip out my heart if you require it. I don't care. I only want to see Hollie safe. Every moment you hold me here is another moment she is in danger. No one wants to see anything horrible befall Hollie, the Queen said mildly. No need to rip out any hearts, no matter how tempting the offer might be. She motioned for him to stand. I have followed your pursuit of the human female with interest, seeing as my girls are close to Hollie. You'll forgive me for generalizing, but your kind aren't known for their restraint nor their selflessness. Elsbeth held out a hand to her king, and the serious-faced male took it. I know what it is to need a mate more than life, and, in a way, I know what it is to lose a mate. I would not wish that fate on anyone, even a leech. Please, Majesty, he whispered urgently. I promise I will not hurt her. I only want to protect her. She considered his words, then gave a nod. I will release you, but on 2 conditions. First, you will not ask my children to accompany you. They are too gracious to turn you down, and although they have not revealed it yet, they are each carrying my grandchildren. Stunned gasps echoed around him. Maz saw identical looks of shock on the faces of the males who had pledged their lives and loyalties to the daughters of the Fae Queen. Thanks for ruining the surprise, Mother, Gilly said sarcastically, then let loose a string of giggles when Solomon picked her up and spun her around in delight. Bracken was looking at his wife like he might break her. Gently he took her into his arms, marveling at her belly and the tiny life it contained. "Is she telling the truth?" Lena nodded, a small smile on her face, and he bent to kiss her softly. Elspeth beamed at her children, then returned her attention to the vampire. "Secondly, once Hollie is safe, she will be allowed to make the decision on her own. She will choose whether to accept you as a mate or not, and you must abide by that decision. Vow it now, and I will release the shield." Maz froze. A vow made to a magic user was extremely hard to break, and given the power of the Fae Queen, it might prove impossible. Can I let her go if she wants me to? Even the question had his instincts in an uproar. "I vow it," he said, pushing down the doubts. "Her safety is paramount." "Good," Elspeth said, clapping her hands. "Then go with my blessings, and—" He watched her reach into a pocket in her elaborate dress. "Take this." The Queen held out something to him, dropping it in his hand. "What is it?" he asked, looking down at the little brown shape. "An acorn," she said with a little shrug. "Use it only in case of emergency." "What does it—" he started asking, but before he could finish the question, Phaedra interrupted. "Let's get moving, Vamp," she said, grabbing the wrist of his left hand. He scarcely had time to tuck the acorn away before Taylor took his other hand. Cass rolled her eyes, shaking her head like she couldn't believe she was about to head off with the Fae again to help out a vampire. She finally took Phaedra's hand, looking at him and nodding. Maz nodded back and took a deep breath, preparing to travel to his mate immediately. Closing his eyes, he reached for the blood connection within. "I'm coming for you, Hollie," he said in his mind. "No," he corrected himself. "We are coming for you." He felt the world whoosh away, every fiber of his being focused on his mate. Chapter 21. "You're kidding me," her father said, laughing. "She's still taking that dog around with her everywhere?" Hollie nodded. "I heard the ladies at the bank told her that if the dog pees on the carpet one more time, they'll close out her accounts and she can do her banking in Coloma." They'd gone for a stroll around the ruins to continue their reminiscences. Every now and again, Hollie would glance toward the center of the former city, where the dais sat above its surroundings. Two figures still stood in the corner, their debate continuing to rage. She could make out Dallin on the edge of the circle, still cowering, and wondered whether the imp would ever get what he wanted out of the princes. Not that he deserves it, she thought. Hollie wasn't one to wish anyone at eternity spent rotting in jail, but the way she was feeling now, she'd consider the imp a prime candidate for punishment. "Is that a fountain?" Hollie asked when they came upon an empty square that escaped much of the collapse of a nearby wall unscathed. Hurrying forward, she was amazed to find water still trickling through holes shaped like flowers, and in the basin, tiny silver fish swam in the clear depths. Her father motioned her over to one of the benches arrayed around the fountain, and she sat with him, Wendy rolling next to her to continue his watch on their surroundings. "We've been tiptoeing around something since we found each other again," Frank started gently, and Hollie immediately went on alert. "Please don't let him say something about my leaving. I don't want to hear anything about the nobility of sacrifice and that we'll see each other again someday." She'd already made up her mind to stay in the night-drenched world in order to keep her father's ghost in existence. "What do you mean?" she asked, looking down at her feet and tucking a lock of hair behind her ear. "You haven't told me what you're doing here," he said, then pointed in the direction of the dais. "Nor have you explained what those two have to do with it." Hollie sighed, partly in relief, but also at the enormity of the task before her. "It's complicated," she started, then chuckled. "It would have to be, right? We're sitting on another world, who knows how far away from Earth, chatting like it's any old day in Watoma, and one of us isn't—" He gave her a nod and a patient smile, and she took a deep breath and tried again. "There's this vampire." "And I thought those two characters were bad," her father said, shaking his head. "Now I'm learning there are vampires too. I haven't come to grips with the whole being a ghost thing yet, and now you're going to tell me you're mixed up with a vampire." "Afraid so, Pops," she said, trying to keep her tone light. "Apparently vampires mate for eternity. Their mates are predestined, and it has something to do with the way their blood resonates. I can't explain it, but I've come to learn that having a human mate is extremely rare." "Are you telling me what I think you're telling me?" Her dad's voice got low and was filled with concern. "You're dating a vampire." "I wouldn't say dating, not exactly."
She ran her hands through her hair, trying to think of the best way to explain. Maybe I should start from the beginning. Hollie laid out the whole sordid tale from vampire stalker to unknown abductor. A time in the Hell Realm, meeting the Fae, then a witch who tried to help her. Dallin, the Princess of Darkness, and Nev, the woman who wanted revenge for the way she'd treated her private realm. By the time she was finished, Hollie's throat was dry. So that's how I ended up here. Her father was staring at her, not blinking or saying a word. Concerned, she leaned over to pat his hand and ended up patting the stone bench instead. Dad? That's a lot to take in, sweetheart, he said after a long exhale. I can't exactly say I'm excited to hear that you've got a vampire boyfriend, and I assume I have him to thank for that mark on your neck? Hollie's hand found the small puncture wounds, and she blushed. It was a precaution, she hurried to say. With just a little bit of blood, he can locate me anywhere that I am. Comes in handy when you're being fought over by a couple narcissistic crazies who just happen to have magical powers. Her father's mouth compressed into a thin line. Isn't that about the same as the tracking chip we put in Mr. Kitty when you were a kid to make sure he didn't get lost? You could say that, Hollie said, trying to keep a hopeful look on her face. He has promised not to abuse the privilege. People promise lots of things, her dad grumbled. Hollie pushed through the awkwardness, reminded of how overprotective Frank had been on prom night. He'd told her date to take his car and have her home by 11 p.m., or he would report the car stolen. I know the risks, she admitted, and I can't say I'm entirely comfortable with what's happened, but I do believe he cares for me. He wouldn't have gone through everything he has if he didn't. This would be your first serious relationship, he pointed out. It seems like you might be getting in over your head. Hollie laughed. You can say that again. She gazed out over the fountain, wondering if the little fish inside it ever had worry about anything as complicated as matehood. How did it work with you and Mom? She asked him, hoping he could shed some light on things for her. How did it work? It was his turn to be on the spot. I guess it worked out pretty good, since I ended up with an amazing daughter as well as a wonderful wife. But how did you know Mom was the one? Hollie asked. There are plenty of things I like about the vampire, but as you can imagine, there are some things I absolutely don't. Well, your mother never turned into a bat on me, Frank said, causing Hollie to dissolve into giggles. But we had our ups and downs like any other couple. I think I knew she was the right woman for me when she stayed after class one night to help me with my accounting homework. You had trouble in accounting, she asked, gasping. Yes, now you know my dirty secret. The ghost of a smile crossed his lips. Your mother was so good with numbers, she spent almost 2 weeks teaching me how to prepare a proper cash flow statement. He laughed, shaking his head. When I got a C+ on the exam that week, she took me out for ice cream to celebrate, mint chocolate chip. She somehow knew it was my favorite. Her mother had some sort of sixth sense when it came to favorites. She'd always made just the right dinner for Hollie when she'd been in the dumps about something that happened at school or with her friends. And every year on her birthday, her mother would bake the most elaborate cakes to make Hollie and her father feel special. Hollie could picture her parents back in college, young and full of energy, with their whole lives ahead of them. Mom was the best. Losing her mother had turned her world upside down, and if it hadn't been for her father, Hollie wasn't certain she would have recovered. As it was, she wasn't sure her father ever had. Sure, he'd kept up a cheerful demeanor, but sometimes she wondered if it was for her sake. There was a shadow in his eyes that hadn't been there before her mother passed, and Hollie couldn't imagine how it must have felt to lose the person you'd hoped to grow old with. That will never happen with Maz, an inner voice told her. He will never grow old, will never die, at least not of natural causes. Hollie wasn't certain if that was a blessing or another curse. She really was, he said, a note of sadness in his voice. She was so generous, so compassionate. I think that's what I loved about her the most. I think Maz can be generous and compassionate too, Hollie said. At least, I hope he can. She bit her lip, wondering if they'd ever have time to explore the connection between them without the pressures of matehood and the Princess of Darkness constantly weighing them down. Does he have any other qualities you admire? Her dad asked gently. He's funny, she said, and polite. Handsome, of course. Strong, protective. Her face scrunched up as she considered the question. He's smart, and he doesn't back down from a fight. I think we could have fun together if we were ever in a situation where our lives weren't on the line. And what qualities don't you like?" he continued.
"Well, the whole blood drinking thing is kind of a bummer," she said, making her father laugh. "Seriously, though, I'm not sure I can get past that. Then again, vegans probably consider me a murderer on the same level as a vampire, so maybe everything is relative."
"Not everything," her father corrected. "Commitment isn't relative. It's an absolute."
"That's one area I don't have to worry about," Hollie told him. "He's committed to me. Has been from the very beginning. I'm the one with cold feet."
"I can't blame you, sweetheart," he said. "You're staring down the barrel of promising to spend a lifetime with someone you barely know."
"I might chance it if it were only a lifetime." Vampires, however, were capable of living much longer than the typical human lifespan. "But what do you do when it's literal eternity?" Her father considered the question, but before he could answer, Hollie heard a female voice in her mind. "Hollie, Cass again. We're on our way to save you, so if you'd like to give us any warning about what we're up against, think about it with all your concentration, and I might get it. See you soon."
"Are you okay?" her father asked,
concern writ large on his features. "I think so," Hollie said, holding her forehead. "I've just received a message. Now I need to reply." Squeezing her eyes tight, Hollie focused all of her concentration on the images of the two princes of darkness on the dais. "Two princes fighting over me. Every girl's dream, right?" She wasn't sure if her reply was received, but she hoped it was. Hollie hopped up, her eyes going again to the dais. Nothing had changed there, which meant they hadn't yet arrived. "I think we're about to have some visitors," she told her father and Wendy. Her heart beating hard, she realized she was nervous about seeing Maz again. She wasn't sure if it was the conversation she just shared with her father, or the fact that the last time they were together, he'd tasted her blood. And I loved it. The memory of that pleasure washed over her now, making her skin tingle. She ducked her head, hoping to hide her blush from her father. He was distracted, thankfully, by the robot who had activated his jets and was now floating at chest level. Heart pounding, skin tingling, Hollie waited, counting the seconds until the cavalry arrived. She told herself she was excited to see her friends again, but there was only one image in her mind, the image of a muscular male with ice blue eyes that seemed to see deep into her soul. Forever's a long time, she told herself. To be with someone, or to be without him. Chapter 22. A flash turned the sky a blanket white, followed by an explosion that rocked the night, leaving Hollie's ears ringing. "I bet that's my friends," she announced, smiling to help banish the look of dismay on her father's face. "We should get closer."
"Get closer to that," he blanched, shaking his head. "I think we should head in the opposite direction. Let's find a place to hide and wait things out."
"It's okay, Dad," Hollie said softly. "I'm scared too, but they're my friends and they've come here to help me. I can't abandon them." He digested her words, and a moment later he nodded.
"I guess I don't have a body to be worried about anyway," he said with a shrug. "Let's go."
She followed her father when he floated forward in the direction of the dais. Wendy was at her side, and although the bot didn't technically have a face, she still sensed his air of determination. Hollie felt grateful in that moment, grateful for the people who were banding together to help her. The odds were stacked against them, but her friends had not yet let her down. Confident that they could handle whatever they went up against, Hollie let hope fill her, making her steps lighter. She was on the verge of smiling when a shadow appeared suddenly in front of them, blocking their path.
"You!"
she heard Dallin hiss. He came forward into the circle of light cast by Wendy's torch.
"How could you?"
The imp waved his finger in Hollie's face, his expression murderous.
"Is this the vampire?" Frank asked, confused.
Dallin's eyes cut to him, but the imp dismissed the shade out of hand.
"You let him drink you, didn't you?"
"Leave me alone, Dallin," Hollie said, pushing her way past him. "You're out of options now. You brought your prize to the auction, and you got your little bidding war. Why don't you run along and find a card game to lose your shirt in?"
"Don't talk to me like that, you little snot!"
the imp roared, his skin cracking and turning black, his true form revealed.
"You are nothing but a simple-minded human, a walking blood bag for your mate." "You are not to treat my daughter like that," her father roared, rushing forward and swinging his fist at the imp.
Dallin ignored him, and Frank floated through him, his blows failing to land. "Your daughter is a leech's lover," he said, his eyes never leaving Hollie's face. "She let him drink from her, let a leech suckle until he had his fill. Disgusting!" Dallin might as well have spit at her feet from the expression on his face. Shame doused her like a sudden downpour. She once again attempted to push past the imp, but he grabbed her by the back of her neck and shook her. "I know that's how he found us. There's no other way he could have. How does it feel to be a vampire's snack?" The little red robot shot forward, bumping into Dallin's side, making his grip on Hollie slip. She tore herself away from him, anger making her shake. "Better than being an imp's pawn," she said, then resorted to a move she'd never tried because she considered it undignified. Hollie reared back her leg before kicking Dallin squarely between the legs. He howled in pain, his knees coming together, hands covering the affected area. Then he keeled over, lying on his side and moaning. Her father looked at her in amazement. "Normally I would say that's a no-no, but I'll make an exception in this case." "Let's go," she said, taking a hold of Wendy's hand and hurrying forward. "He might be a pain in the behind, but he's not the type to stay down long." They rushed toward the dais, Hollie's eyes darting over and over to the platform, hoping to catch sight of her friends, but there was too much activity for her to tell what was happening until they turned the last corner and rushed up the steps. The scene that greeted them was pure pandemonium. Beams of energy in various colors shot back and forth, and shapes that might be her friends moved in blurs against the two figures in the center of the dais. She caught sight of a shape that was darker than the others, zipping back and forth in front of the figures, but never getting close to them. It paused for a second to beat fists against an invisible force field, and Hollie saw that it was Maz. He raked his claws down a surface no one could see, then blurred off again to do the same thing on the other side. The force field was protecting the princes who stood inside it, looking vaguely bored. They didn't even bat an eye when a massive hairy spider 3 times the size of a man trundled toward them and splayed its body against the force field, its legs seeking purchase. Hollie's gaze cut to Cass, who was manipulating the magical creature by the motions of her hands. The witch looked tired, her face pale, but she refused to give up the fight. She'd more than earned her fee, Hollie thought, her heart filling with appreciation. She no longer considered Cass a hired gun. Now she was, and always would be, a friend. The spider failed to climb the invisible shield, and the witch let out a screech of frustration, then waved her hands. The spider vanished, replaced by a rope of pure light that circled the shield. Hollie could see it pulsing, squeezing against the shield. "Link with me!" Cass shouted to Taylor, who stopped shooting purple blasts of energy and rushed to her side. When the two joined hands, the rope of light doubled in size and brightness. It squeezed harder against the shield, and Hollie thought she could see some progress, the rope seeming to constrict against the invisible cylinder. She let out a shout of triumph, then regretted it when her call caught the vampire's attention. Maz bolted forward, little more than a blur as he rushed in her direction. But he didn't make it far before his body catapulted high into the air, coming to a stop above the princes. He hung there, his limbs flailing, but he seemed unable to get down. Inside the shield, Samael was looking upward, a smile on his face at his handiwork. The net that kept Maz aloft held him fast. Phaedra, giving up banging against the shield with a sword, leapt into the air, her wings carrying her to the vampire's side. She cut at the invisible net, tugging on the vamp's arms to try and dislodge him, but nothing seemed to work. "Shoo fly!" a voice boomed. Then a wind picked up to gale force, blowing Phaedra away. The Fae tumbled several feet before righting herself. She made another attempt, and again the wind took her out, this time tangling her wings so that she plummeted to the ground, landing with a painful oof.
"Phaedra!"
Taylor yelled.
"Over here! Link with us, and help us take down their shield!"
The warrior Fae struggled to her feet and limped over, grabbing Taylor's hand. In that instant, the rope of light became almost blinding, its power redoubled. A loud cracking sound echoed around them, the invisible shield beginning to buckle under the strength of the linked women. Inside the force field, Aramon scowled. Thunder crackled above them, dark clouds rushing in to obscure the triple moons. Hollie broke out in chills, lightning flashing and casting long shadows, reminding her of something out of a horror movie. A bolt shot down to the ground, hitting the spot where Cass had been standing a moment before. Another bolt followed, then another, each aimed at the linked females. One finally connected, and Taylor let out a cry of agony. The link was broken, the rope of light disappearing, leaving the shield damaged but intact. The injured Fae lay there, her wings singed, her body smoking. Hollie rushed toward her on instinct, hoping there was something she could do to help. Before she got more than a handful of steps, the dais tilted on its axis, spilling her over the side. She rolled down a couple steps and hit the stone floor, her head impacting against the cold marble. A roar of rage reverberated through the ruins. Hollie's gaze found Maz, who was watching her with red-eyed intensity. He redoubled his struggles, biting and clawing at his invisible bonds. A chuckle rose from behind the shield. Samael, clearly amused by the game he was playing with them. Frank was at her side, his expression panicky. "Are you all right, kiddo? Answer me!" "I'll survive," she said with a groan, climbing to her feet. She returned her attention to their antagonist in the center of the dais. "Let him go!" Hollie screamed, tired of the prince's antics. "He's never done anything but serve you." Although she hadn't known the vampire long, she felt she knew him well enough to judge his character. His integrity was unimpeachable, but it looked as if his boss did not value his servant's loyalty. Samael turned his gaze on her, an arrogant grin on his striking face. In that moment, she heard a voice inside her head, smooth as ice. "You should be thanking me for keeping him out of the fray, unless you prefer that he suffers." Maz screamed suddenly, his body shaking as if under duress by an unseen assailant. "Stop it!" Hollie shouted at Samael. "You're just being cruel." "I prefer to think of it as a kindness," the voice replied, as intimate as a whisper between friends. "I'm giving a taste of what he'll suffer when he learns the essential fallacy of matehood." The statement shook her, but now didn't seem like the appropriate time to dig into the warped sensibilities of a man who called himself the Angel of Death. She'd picked herself up and was limping her way back up the steps when she saw a dark form lurking behind one of the columns, watching the circus of pain. "Dallin!" she yelled, making the imp flinch. "Do something! Help Maz, please!" The imp shook his head vehemently. Her temper broke its leash. "You owe me! You owe us for everything you've put us through!" "There's nothing I can do," he replied, a hollow expression on his face. With a final look towards the princes, Dallin vanished. "No!" Tears filled her eyes, and she dashed them away angrily. Hollie refused to give up, the vampire's cries of agony making her feel smaller, as if her guilt were compressing her. "It's my fault he's in this situation. I came along and rearranged his life just as completely as he did mine."
"Hollie, you've got to get to safety."
Wendy was at her hip, tugging on her dress.
"It is obvious that we are outmatched."
"I can't just leave them. I can't leave him." Hollie was frantic. She grabbed the robot, pulling his dome to her face.
"You've got to help him. Please, if there's anything you can do."
Dark purple lights fired within the dome, and he took a moment to respond.
"Affirmative,"
he said at last, a panel in his shoulder sliding open to allow what resembled a miniature version of the laser weapons the security units had used back in Gresher's workshop. Jets firing full throttle, the brave little robot shot upward toward the imprisoned Maz. Her father let out a grunt of frustration. "This has gone on long enough. If anyone is going to mess with my possible future son-in-law, it's going to be me. Until then, I need him whole," Frank grumbled, his shade pushing up its sleeves. He levitated higher, following in Wendy's wake. Hollie's hands rose to her face, her eyes glued to the action taking place above the shield. Both princes had raised their attention to the dangling vampire, whose suffering had him foaming at the mouth. She saw the robot reach his side, Wendy extending his arm, his little white hand reaching for Maz's shoulder. Frank appeared on his other side, reaching for him at the same time. Hollie had no idea what they might be capable of, but she knew if the two in the shield went without a distraction, they'd be free to focus their efforts on the pair trying to help him. "Phaedra, you've got to link again!" Hollie shouted, waving her arms at the Fae, who'd managed to get a companion back on her feet with the help of the witch. "You've got to take down that shield now!" The warrior woman nodded, grabbing Cass's hand and Taylor's soot-covered one. They burst into a bright white glow and began walking forward together, intent on finishing the job they'd started earlier. That's when she heard them, the whispers, seeming to come from all sides. They reached a crescendo, sounding like an enormous flock of birds startled into flight. Hollie grabbed her ears, her face a rictus of pain. "No!" A ray of light shot down from the sky like a gigantic spotlight. It covered Maz and the pair attempting to help him, obscuring them from view before slamming into the top of the prince's shield, where it splintered into 3 rays which aimed themselves directly at the linked trio. Chapter 23. Where three had stood a second before, now there was only empty space. Cass, Taylor, and Phaedra were hurtling backwards, propelled by the impact of the ray. There was a tremendous cracking sound, and Hollie caught panic in the expressions of both princes before a boom echoed through the ruins.
That was their shield. It's down.
Her eyes flew to Maz, who was smoking. The top layer of his skin burned black. Her heart constricted, and she stumbled forward, moving until she was under him, ignoring the two figures who were watching her intently, twin looks of confusion on their faces.
"What did you do to the shield?"
Samael said, a dark look in his eyes. She ignored him, calling up to the vampire. "Maz! Can you hear me? Maz!" A sudden peal of thunder obscured any response he might have made. A split second later, 24 bolts of lightning rained down on the dais. Hollie froze, watching several impact around her. Looking back, she saw an angry Samael holding what appeared to be a large umbrella made of dark energy that covered both his brother and Hollie.
"Whatever you're doing, human, you're going to regret it,"
the angel of death growled at her. "It isn't me!" she cried, flinching as another round of lightning struck. A bolt hit the vampire, who twitched like a glitching video game character. Wendy, his little hand still clutching at his shoulder, jerked as well, the charge spreading to his little body through Maz. Their gyrations spilled over into the space occupied by Frank, who let out an exclamation of surprise. Hollie felt like she would explode from anxiety, the tension of seeing her friends tortured about to break her. Another bolt hit them, and the ghostly form of her father wavered. When the charge dissipated, Maz went limp, and so did Wendy, his jets giving out. The little bot hurtled toward the ground, and Hollie's instincts took over. She positioned herself underneath him, her arms outstretched. Bracing herself, she reached out and caught the robot before it could hit the ground. The impact hurt, but she ignored the pain.
"Wendy, speak to me!"
The lights that usually fired in his dome were absent, and his form was scorched and stilled. Afraid that the bot was damaged beyond repair, she looked upward to check the condition of the vampire and her father. The bluish glow of the ghost had vanished, leaving only the motionless vampire, who looked like he'd been dipped in black paint. He was now hanging upside down, the electricity from the lightning having vibrated him into a new position.
"Stop playing games, little girl,"
Samael said from beside her. He grabbed her by the chin, forcing her to face him. "If you think what he's been through is bad, it's only the beginning. I will flay the skin from each one of your friends for the next 10,000 years if you don't cease whatever you're doing that's making this happen. For the last time!" Her words were cut out by the cacophony of 1,000,000 wings flapping at the same moment. The air around them exploded in black feathers, and in the confusion, Hollie pulled out of Samael's grip. Carrying the lifeless bot, she scrambled away from the center of the dais, knowing what was coming. The sudden appearance of a fantastically beautiful woman draped in black satin surprised everyone but her. Nev, the woman she'd come to call the Dark Lady, in her own thoughts, greeted the princes with a smile. "Hey, fellows, long time no see." "Nev Royale," Sam spat. "Of course it's you. You thought it was the human," she burst out laughing. "Isn't that just laughable?" Hollie felt a sudden pressure around her waist, and suddenly she was dragged backwards, right back to the center of the dais. "I don't know where you think you're scuttling off to," Nev told her. "Things are just getting started." "What is the meaning of this, sister?" Armand demanded. "You disappear for eons, then show up unannounced, bombarding us with lightning like we're some sort of garden variety demons?" "Why didn't you tell me, brother?" she said, her tone mocking. "You two are the ones who started this little farce, sending a human to do your dirty work. You really are scraping the bottom of the barrel." Araman and Samael looked at each other, twin expressions of confusion on their faces. "We started nothing," Araman said after a moment. "You're the one resorting to violence out of the gate." "Nonsense!" Nev's face was mottled red, her temper getting the better of her. "My so-called family likes nothing better than ganging up on whoever it considers the weakest member. What a shock, assuming the sole girl child is the most vulnerable, thus the ripest for ridicule. I wouldn't stand for it then, and I won't stand for it now." "No one is ganging up on you," Samael said angrily, raising his index finger. "You were the one destined to destroy everything, remember? Or do you not let a little thing like an apocalypse prophecy get in your way either?" "Monster!" Nev cried, then raised a hand, a bolt of dark energy shooting from her palm. Samael caught it, seeming to absorb the energy into his own hand. "Play nice, sister," he said with an arrogant tone. "I don't understand why you are doing this," Ahriman said, genuine concern in his voice. "The truce has stood since time immemorial. Why break it now? Over what?" "I did not break the truce," Nev countered. "The two of you did, dragging the human into your business and shoving her into mine. I mean, a human? How pathetic and desperate can you get?" Even a worthless human like Hollie could see that they were talking in circles. "No one sent me anywhere," she protested. "It was a mistake, an accident." The trio of evil royalty paid her no mind, and she gave up in a huff. This time, when she marched off the dais, Nev did nothing to pull her back. She was deep into the sibling disagreement, the three of them having resorted to reliving petty squabbles from the past. Another quick glance skyward told her that the vampire had yet to revive himself. An icy tidal wave of fear crashed over her, and Hollie worried that maybe the lightning had been too much for the vamp. Not Maz, she told herself. He's strong enough to survive anything. Rushing down the steps, she scanned the ruins for the missing women. She caught sight of a section of wing behind a tumbled boulder and ran toward it, finding a crumpled Phaedra groaning on the ground behind it. "Are you okay?" Hollie asked anxiously, setting the motionless Wendy down beside her to carefully search the Fae's body for wounds. "Never better," Phaedra groaned, pushing herself into a sitting position. Then she saw the state of a wing, bent to an odd angle, and hissed, "Oh, somebody is going to pay for that." Hollie jerked her thumb over her shoulder. "You can address your revenge to the woman on the dais." Phaedra followed the direction of her gesture and scowled. "Her again? How did we get so lucky?" Hollie helped her to stand. "Can you still fight?" "Always," Phaedra said, but Hollie could see the strain around her eyes. She put her shoulder underneath the Fae's arm and helped her limp forward, pushing to collect the bolt with her other hand. "We should find the others first. Regroup." Guilt was pounding her like a boxer punching a heavy bag. "I'm the only one who's relatively unscathed. Wendy might be dead. Maz, too. And the ghost of my father is gone." Her gaze shot to the Fae, who was doing her best not to flinch but losing the battle. And I've never seen Phaedra look so rough. The Fae was a consummate warrior, always projecting strength and skill. To see her this weak was a blow to Hollie's confidence. "I think I see Cass," Phaedra said, jerking her chin in the direction where she'd spotted the witch. Cass lay in the rubble of what appeared to be a stone altar that had shattered with the force of the witch's impact. Placing Wendy down carefully, she helped brace Phaedra against a nearby wall and moved to Cass's side. "Can you hear me, Cass?" she asked softly, gently touching the woman's cheek. The witch's clothes were covered in a gray dust that had also powdered her hair in a way that reminded Hollie of the Founding Fathers' wigs. "Cass?" "I told you, headmistress, I didn't put a snake in Henrietta's pillowcase, I swear." The words were mumbled. Cass's expression pained. "Wake up, Cass!" Hollie spoke more forcefully, raining small slaps on her cheeks until the witch's eyes opened. "Is it third period already?" A dazed look was in her eyes. Hollie looked back at Phaedra, who shrugged. Turning back to the witch, she held a finger in front of her eyes. "Follow my finger," she suggested, moving it slowly back and forth until Cass's eyes could focus. Hollie pulled her upright, and the witch shivered, attempting to knock some of the dust off her body. "Remind me next time to include hazard pay in my contracts." Always the businesswoman, Hollie thought, hiding a smile. "Are you okay? Can you walk?" "Well, my pride is bruised along with my arse, but I think I'll make it." There was a sudden blast in the direction of the dais, and Hollie turned to face it just in time to see a spout of flame shoot into the air, high enough to tickle Maz's toes. He didn't move an inch, though, and her stomach dropped. "He's not dead," she told herself. "He's hurt, but not dead. Down, but not out. He just needs a little time to recover." Hollie bent to retrieve the robot once again. "Any sign of Taylor?" Phaedra shook her head. "We should split up and look for her." Hollie watched as Phaedra hobbled off in one direction, Cass in another. Taking a deep breath, she set off in a third, pushing away her fears about the vampire. "She's over here!" Hollie heard a few minutes later. She rushed in the direction of Cass's voice, rounding a corner to find her crouching beside the Fae, who was holding an enormous knot on her head. "How's she doing?" Hollie asked softly as Phaedra tottered toward them. "She could be better, if I'm being honest." Cass's expression was wan, worry broadcasting from her eyes. Hollie went to her knees to inspect the Fae herself. Taylor gave her a weak smile. I'll be okay, she said, then coughed heavily, leaving a pink tinge on her lips. I know what that means, Hollie thought. Internal bleeding. All of this is my fault. It was like a litany in her head, over and over, the faces of her friends, wreathed in pain in the name of helping her. It was getting to be too much to bear. What if that blast had done worse? What if you'd found them dead and not just hurt? Just rest a moment, Hollie said, smiling down at the Fae. You'll feel better after you catch your breath. She sidled over to Cass, speaking softly in her ear. Can you use your power to heal her? The witch shook her head. If I do, that will be it. I'm almost completely tapped out as it is. I'm saving what little power I have left to open a portal when we need it. Hollie's eyes flew to Phaedra, who was just now reaching Taylor's side. She gingerly sat beside her, letting out a hiss of pain in the process, and took Taylor's hand. Hollie considered asking her to heal the other Fae, but she figured if she had any juice left, she would have done so without being asked. They're on their last legs, she thought, eyes flitting once more to the motionless vampire. If we keep pushing, they're gonna fall. Everything had gone wrong, and Hollie was cursing herself for a fool. Earlier, she'd figured she was just biding time until the cavalry showed up, so confident was she that they could overcome any obstacles. She wanted to groan, to sob to the starless sky. Instead, she sat without moving, wondering if they could recover from what they'd just experienced. Looking around at the three women in front of her, Hollie realized they were the best friends she'd ever had. I can't sacrifice them. Can't ask them to give away their life in exchange for mine. I've got to let them go. Chapter 24. You should go. As soon as the words were out of her mouth, Hollie felt their rightness. 3 sets of eyes turned toward her, round with disbelief. What are you talking about? Cass said, at the same time as Phaedra asked. Go where? Go. Take off. Get out of here. Make like a tree and leave. She realized her chest was heaving, her breath sawing in and out of her. You have no idea how much I appreciate all your efforts, but if you don't go now, you're not going to make it. We can't win, not against 3 of them. We aren't exactly the type to give up, Phaedra said, an incredulous expression on her face. As long as there is breath in our bodies. Yeah, Taylor croaked, then fell back, the single word exhausting her. See, that's what I mean, Hollie said, throwing up her hands. No one could ever doubt your bravery, but there is a point when it becomes foolishness. We can't stand against them, so you should go. Now, while they're distracted with their own petty squabbles. Hollie, Phaedra said in a tone she might use on a slow child, we're not going to just abandon you here. If you want to go, let's go. But you're coming with us. I can't. Hollie knew she could try, but that even if she escaped today, it only meant one more of their enemies would come looking for her. And who knows who might get hurt then? She looked upwards at the dangling body of the vampire and sighed. I can't leave him either. It wouldn't be right. Even if he wanted me to, I couldn't go. Hollie was beginning to think that there might be something to the whole maidhood thing after all. The feelings she was experiencing weren't like anything she'd ever had before. Sure, she had crushes on boys in school and on the occasional young man she'd seen around Watoma, but Cupid's arrow had never struck home. Before now, this isn't the time to get all sentimental, she told herself. Stick to the task at hand. She steeled her expression, standing firm. Yeah, that's not happening, Phaedra said, struggling to her feet. If you stay, we stay. End of story. Hollie had expected some resistance, knowing full well how stubborn the Fae warrior could be. The earth beneath them began to shake, the quake radiating from the dais. Columns shook, walls crumbled, and debris fell all around them. They're going to tear this realm apart, Hollie said, and I don't want you here when they do. Then come with us, Cass said. She stood and held out her hand. We can be out of here in less than a minute. Hollie looked back over her shoulder at where Maz's form hung. Turning back, she shook her head. They'll come for me, over and over until they get what they want. She took Cass's hand and pulled the woman into an embrace. I'm grateful, she said, her voice breaking. Oh, so very grateful. I've never had true friends like you before, and I'll never forget you. Stop talking like that, Phaedra demanded. You're coming with us. The face snatched her up in a hold.
Make the portal now, Cass. I'll toss her through it. The witch shook her head. She's got a point. They'll keep coming for her. And we'll keep fighting, Phaedra countered. Eventually they'll give up. After they destroy how many worlds? Cass asked. I won't lead them back to Samothrace. Are you inviting them to your realm? Phaedra scowled. There has to be a way. We can go to neutral territory, regroup, figure out a strategy to beat them. Thank you, Hollie said, turning Phaedra's grip into an embrace. For everything. I never would have made it off Aramanabad if it weren't for you, but you can't protect me forever. Not against insurmountable odds. Come on, Hollie. You know you can't stay, Phaedra sniffed, blinking back tears. These are bad creatures, and whichever one you end up with, you'll be miserable. You can't just surrender, not like this. Sometimes it's wiser to give up the fight. Phaedra scoffed. A falser statement has never been spoken. Taylor coughed again, and this time blood spurted from her mouth. Cass leaned over and dabbed at her lips. She gave Hollie a look, shaking her head. The ground shook again, this time more powerfully. Cracks started to appear in the ground beneath them. We've got to go, Cass yelled, motioning to Phaedra. Help me get her up. Let's go, Hollie, Phaedra said as she held Taylor against her. The other woman's head was lolling, and Hollie knew she'd be unconscious in a matter of moments. You can't stay here. I can. I've asked too much of you. This is my fight now. She gave Phaedra what she hoped was a confident smile. It's time for me to stand on my own. Green light flooded the area, and Cass stumbled as the portal roared to life. I can't hold it open for long, she cried, then helped Phaedra walk Taylor toward it. Phaedra looked back, a look of raw vulnerability on her face. Please, come with us. Hollie shook her head and waved, blowing the Fae a kiss. I'll see you again sometime, she said, then turned away. She heard the portal crackle for a few seconds more, then it went silent. The green light vanishing, Hollie let out a ragged breath. Saying goodbye to her friends hadn't been easy, but she felt a weight lifting off her, knowing that they would be safe, knowing that they would survive. Hollie lowered herself to a rock and sat, bending to pick up Wendy and cradle him in her arms. She kept her eyes on the dais, watching as sparks flew and flames spouted. Whatever battle was taking place between the three seemed very far away now. She was making her peace with the way things were ending. The longer Maz remained motionless, the more certain she became that he was already dead. That first ray was too powerful for him, she told herself. It burned him to a crisp, and he wasn't even conscious for the lightning that followed. It was a good narrative, one that allowed her to believe that he'd escaped the worst of the pain. She was able to disconnect a little further, to let go a little more. It made saying goodbye just a little bit easier, assuming it was only a matter of time before the princes and their royal sister remembered her existence and decided to punish her for it. Hollie took the moments remaining to reflect on her life. Back in Watoma, she lamented the lack of good friends. She'd been worried that she was wasting her life, that nothing exciting would ever happen to her. Hollie laughed at herself now. You wanted adventure, and boy, did you ever get it. Of their own accord, her eyes lifted to the vampire once again. You even flirted with falling in love, she told herself, wondering what might have been if she'd agreed to stay with Maz in his pocket dimension, safe from the princes and the hell they were currently unleashing. She'd grown so much in such a short time, in ways she hadn't thought possible. Hollie had always been shy, always a people-pleaser, and never considered very clever. But she'd come out of her shell and proved to herself that there was so much she could do, so much more to see than what was in Watoma or even Wisconsin. I've seen trees taller than skyscrapers, magic that can transform, tantalize, and trick, deep deserts, gleaming cities, and ruins that look like scattered bones and teeth. It might not have been my choice to leave home, but now, at the end of my journey, I can't regret anything that I've done. Except losing you, little guy, she said softly, looking down at Wendy, who lay still in her arms. You were amazing, right up to the end. She stroked his translucent dome, missing the cascade of lights. Another look at Maz, who remained unchanged. She swallowed, wondering what they would do with his body. She hoped they would be respectful, but she wasn't holding her breath. Hollie sighed, wishing she'd had a chance to tell him how she felt before the end. Although she couldn't quite put a name to the feeling, either because she was unsure or unable to face the truth, Hollie wished she could have let him know how he made her feel. like something worth living for, something worth dying for. Enough death, she mumbled to herself, dashing the tears from her eyes. The memory of her father rose in her mind, and it almost broke her. Fighting back sobs, she tried to see the hours they'd spent here on Nyx as a gift. She wondered where he'd gone. Wherever it was, she hoped he was happy. The memory of his goofy smile made her inside warm, even as it caused a torrent of tears. "I love you, Daddy," she whispered, hoping somehow, somewhere, he'd hear her. A shower of pink light sparked to life in Wendy's dome, and Hollie looked down, confused. "I love you, too," came from the robot, but not in the bot's usual mechanical voice. "That sounds like my father. Wendy?" she asked, tamping down hope. It must be exhaustion, she told herself. I didn't hear what I thought I did. The robot started to move, so she set him gently on the ground. He wheeled back and forth, his dome turning.
"Reboot completed,"
he said after a moment in his normal voice.
"Presence of unlicensed malware detected."
"Who you calling malware?" It was her father's voice again. Hollie leapt to her feet, looking around, hoping to catch sight of the spectral blue form of her father's shade. But there was nothing around her but debris and dust. There was a series of buzzes and beeps, bringing Hollie's attention back to the bot.
"Security protocols engaged,"
Wendy said, but he sounded off, like he was slightly tipsy. "Oh, no, you're not getting rid of me that easily," her father said again. "Dad, where are you?" she called, still unable to find the source of his voice. "Did you go invisible on me?" "I'm right here." Hollie looked down, realizing there was only one place the voice could be coming from. She knelt beside the bot. "Are you inside Wendy?" "I am," her father grumbled. "And I mean to stay here. So can you tell him to stop trying to expel me from his programming, please?" Hollie picked up the bot and held him up to her face. "Wendy, can you hear me?"
"Affirmative,"
the robot croaked, then made a noise like a hiccup. Hollie asked him to call off his security protocols, and after a series of annoyed beeps, a spray of green sparks in his dome let her know he'd obeyed.
"Protocol established,"
the bot announced.
"Software sharing engaged."
"Thank you, Wendy," Hollie said, beaming down at him and patting his little dome. "I don't know how it happened, but somehow my dad's ghost hitched a ride inside you."
"My current hypothesis has to do with the lightning we were struck with. Your father's ghost was passing through me at the moment of contact. I believe the force of the lightning somehow melded our subroutines together."
"Sounds like a bunch of science gobbledygook to me," her father griped. "You know I failed high school chemistry." "I know, Dad," she said with a laugh, then embraced the robot tightly. "And I might not be able to see your face anymore, but at least I can hug you again." She stayed that way, her arms wrapped around the little red robot, watching the carnage of mayhem unfolding on the dais, her eyes straying over and over again to the dark form dangling lifeless above it all. Chapter 25. The sound of an explosion brought Maz back to consciousness. His memory caught up quickly, reminding him of the attacks he'd suffered, and about the same time his muscles cried out in pain. He kept his eyes closed, hanging upside down above the dais, where he could even now hear the three powerful beings arguing with one another. "You always were a hothead," he heard Aramon curse before a blast caused a tumble of rocks. "But this is ridiculous, Nevrael. Stop attacking us," he heard a female voice screech in anger.
"You're the ones attacking me, ganging up on your little sister like you always did when we were children."
"You were never a child," Samael hissed. "You were always a brainless, vicious harpy, jealous of your brothers." Maz tuned out the argument, the specifics of the hostilities less important to him now than his mate. He could sense her, not far away. She was going through a series of emotional highs and lows, a confusing blast of extreme sorrow and glad elation. What in the hell's going on over there? The vampire didn't have time to investigate. For now, he was just relieved to know she was still alive and still in the same realm that he was. "I've got to get her out of here before she's killed, or worse." If Samael had found them here, it meant that the worst had already happened. His master knew that Maz had met his mate. The vampire knew some of his boss's history, knew that he did not allow mates to those under his thrall. Maz was certain that Samael wasn't interested in making an exception for him. It was time to use the last chance he had to get her away from their enemies and to safety. He was careful to not open his eyes any wider than slits, taking in the scene below him. The princes and their mystery adversary
were taking turns lobbing insults and energy blasts, occasionally exploding columns or knocking down walls and pillars in the ruins surrounding them. His gaze scanned the periphery, and finally he spotted her, his mate. Relief flooded him, taking away some of the fear that was dulling his edge. Just setting eyes on her helped to calm him. Maz searched out to the others, the friends that had vowed to help him rescue Hollie, but he could see no traces of them. Although he wondered what had happened to him, he didn't have time to delay. If he didn't act now, he might never get the chance again. Hollie was several meters away from the dais, and Maz hoped it was far enough for his purposes. It was time to put all of his trust into the only option, which just happened to be one single acorn. Maz's hand crept slowly to the pocket where he'd stashed the acorn after the Fae Queen had given it to him. Once it was in his hand, he started praying to every god he knew that it would work. This was the definition of emergency in his book, so whatever magics the acorn held, he hoped it was enough to defeat the 3 creatures below him, at least for long enough to get Hollie away from them. He let his arm go limp again, hoping that no one was looking up when he moved it. The acorn dangled from the fingertips of his left hand as he positioned it. When he'd gotten himself directly above what he figured was the center of the dais, between the 3 figures quarreling below, Maz took a deep breath and released the acorn. Down it fell until he lost sight of it. Sending out a wordless plea to the multiverse, he counted the seconds until something happened. He only got to 2 before the world around him was bathed in a blinding light. 1 second later, the net that had been holding him tight released. Maz felt himself fall, and immediately he traveled, no longer blocked off from his powers. One moment he was in the air, and the next he was at Hollie's side, trusting entirely to her blood singing inside him to guide him to her. He wrapped his arms around her, still blinded by the light, and immediately teleported, wasting no time. He hoped the acorn had succeeded in at least blinding the others, if not incapacitating them. If he was swift enough, they could escape without them being any the wiser. It wasn't until he was standing on the thick pile rug of his sitting room that Maz could breathe again. "You're alive!" was the first thing he heard, followed by a sob that broke his heart. Maz blinked heavily, his vision beginning to clear. "Please don't cry," he said softly, reaching down to wipe at Hollie's cheeks. "You're safe now." "You were hanging there for so long, I thought the worst," she admitted, whispering into his chest. Then he recoiled when she pounded on him. "You scared the crap out of me!" Maz laughed, hugging her tighter to him. "I'm sorry, precious. I'm okay, as you can see." "I can," she said with amazed wonder. Hollie lifted a finger and traced his cheek, where the skin was shifting from scorched black to bright red and then pink, the burns fading swiftly, thanks to his advanced healing abilities. "I see you still have your little friend with you," he said after a moment, the intimacy of the moment proving too great for him. "I do," Hollie said, her tone becoming stilted. She released Wendy, who floated gently to the floor on his jets. Her eyes stayed on the bot, and Maz wondered what she was waiting for. For a moment, it seemed what she'd expected wasn't going to happen, and he watched her eyes fill with fresh tears. "Is this him?" An unfamiliar voice called from inside the robot. "Is this the vampire?" Hollie let out a cry of relief, going to her knees to hug the bot once more. "I was afraid you would be gone. After Wendy said that shades were trapped on Nyx, I figured you might not be with us anymore." "What's going on?" Maz asked, confused. He'd heard the robot speak before many times, and it hadn't sounded like this. "Is he malfunctioning?" "I guess you could say that." She filled him in on the shades of Nyx, telling him how the ghost of her father had appeared to her and somehow gotten fused with the bot when he tried to help Maz. "Maz, may I introduce you to Frank Townsend, my father?" "Pleased to meet you," Maz said, because he couldn't think of anything else to say. He was as flabbergasted as she was, but after seeing the joy the addition of her father's ghost to the bot brought her, Maz was grateful for the events that had led to their fusing. "Welcome to my home, Mr. Townsend," Maz said solemnly. "You will always be welcome here, just as your daughter is." "Thank you," he heard Frank say gruffly. "But don't think your warm welcome means you're going to get out of the stern talk I owe you. Why would you bring my daughter into that sort of dangerous situation? I just can't comprehend, but if you ever—" "Okay, Dad," Hollie said, blushing sheepishly. "It's been a long day for all of us. Could we save the lecture for later?" "I suppose," Frank grumbled. "I am feeling a little tired after our earlier adventure.
I think I'm going to grab a nap. See you later, sweetie."
Thank goodness, Wendy mumbled. His emotional outburst was taxing my circuits.
Wendy rolled in the direction of the sitting room.
I'll give the two of you some privacy. If you need me, I'll be in the other room.
Maz watched the robot go, shaking his head. A few minutes ago, he had been halfway to certain that he wouldn't survive the next hour. Now he was back in his home, the woman of his dreams in his arms. Fate really is something. "Is there anything I can get you?" he asked her softly, feeling suddenly awkward.
How about an explanation? How in the heck did we get out of Nick's alive?
Hollie bit her lip, and the image sent a wave of heat rushing through his insides.
What was that light?
"An acorn," Maz explained how he'd found himself in the Fae realm and about the gift from Elspeth. He left out the part about allowing Hollie her choice, figuring they could discuss that later, if ever.
"We got lucky,"
Hollie said after a low whistle. Maz agreed with her. "Very. But what happened to the others? I couldn't see them, or I would have tried to help them off Nick's as well. I would have tried, but I can't say for certain I would have gone back for them after I brought you here."
"They took a portal a few minutes before the explosion."
Hollie explained how she'd made them leave, having realized that the princes and their adversary were never going to let her escape.
"I couldn't have their blood on my hands, not after all they've done for me."
She sniffled, and he reached inside his coat to pull out a silk handkerchief. Pressing it into her hand, he wiped away a tear with his thumb. "You kept them safe, even when you wouldn't do the same for yourself."
"It was the least I could do," she said with a shrug. "If I'd gone, I'd only bring more trouble down on them." She blinked up at him. "Like we're risking now. The longer I'm here, the higher the chance that they'll come for me."
"No one knows about this place, remember? It's well hidden. We don't need to worry about anyone coming for you."
"Are you certain?"
she asked, her lip trembling. "I am," he said, bending down to plant a kiss on the tip of her nose. "We're safe now. We can lay low, regroup, figure out our options, the best of which is to stay here forever. I can make you very comfortable, and we won't need anyone else but ourselves." He didn't say the words out loud, not wanting to spook her. Maz hoped she'd come around to the same conclusion on her own. He wasn't going to waste time worrying about the future now, not when he had her in his arms again. Instinct rode him hard, the need to feel her, touch her, taste her, keeping him from releasing her. So far, she hadn't complained, content to remain in the circle of his arms, her head resting on his chest. Maz gently stroked her hair, wondering if there was any greater bliss than holding his mate. Then she looked up at him, and he saw his own need mirrored in her eyes. "There is a greater bliss," he thought, lowering his head slowly until his lips touched hers. Maz kissed his mate, understanding that perfection had a taste and a texture. He gave himself over to waves of pleasure, drowning in his mate and hoping to never have to come up for air. Epilogue. The creature cowering before him missed a glance, making Samael want to bury his boot in the gutless shifter's belly. He was back on Pluto, but being in his own realm did nothing to release him from the tension that was boiling in his belly. "Get out of here," he snarled. "Go prepare as I've instructed." The cringing tiger shifter leapt to his feet, scurrying out of the room, his striped tail waving behind him furiously as he went. The door closed behind Tubo, and Samael turned his back to it. He walked through his expansive suite to the long balcony that ran along one side of the building like battlements. Samael looked out over his realm, feeling empty inside. He'd built his realm from nothing but a speck of dust floating in the ether. Now it was the most powerful of the 17 hell realms, the most feared. But all of his work felt meaningless, as it had for several long centuries. "How long must I rule over my kingdom alone?" he asked himself, even though he knew the answer already. "Forever." It had been several millennia since he'd found her and lost her, and there wasn't a day that passed when he didn't think about her, didn't remember her face. Samael knew that he would never know another woman like her, that he would never know another smile like hers. The emptiness inside him was like a yawning maw, hungry for a delicacy it would never again taste. He knew the hole inside him would never be filled. His mate was gone. And you only get one mate. His hands clenched, and he felt chunks of stone pull away from the balcony railing. It took him several long moments to get his anger under control again. Below him, the capital city of Pluto went about its business, fighting and feasting, loving and losing. But up here, on the heights, there was only one thing that mattered: revenge. Samael turned his mind to his minion, a scowl dominating his handsome face. Even now he knew where the vampire was, cowering in his little hidey hole. Maz thought his lair was hidden, that he was safe there with his mate, that Samael didn't already know every move he would make. Well, almost every move. That little trick back on Nyx was unexpected. He'd been blinded by the blast and knocked off his feet, the strength drained out of him. It was embarrassing, to say the least, and he'd crawled out of sight, not wanting to be vulnerable around his siblings. As soon as he'd had the power, he'd teleported away, back to the safety of his own realm. Samael wondered how his siblings had fared. It had been unexpected seeing his sister again. The mirror had revealed her reflection when Maz had used it on her. The little mirror he'd given to the vampire was linked to the one in his pocket. Samael pulled it out and peered into it. The reflection revealed the vampire locked in an embrace with his little human mate. Samael cursed in disgust, almost throwing the mirror off the balcony to break on the bricks below. But it was too useful to waste in a fit of pique, so he tucked it away, grumbling to himself. The problem was, he'd never had to keep tabs on his vampire minion before. Maz had always been happy to do his bidding before without complaint. Although he would never admit it to the leech, Maz was the closest thing to a son that Samael had ever had. But things had changed, and the weight of betrayal was too heavy for their relationship to bear. In a moment of empathy, a rare enough thing for him, Samael reminded himself how he'd felt when he first discovered his mate. The giddy wonder of learning the other half of your soul was a powerful thing, perhaps the most powerful in the entire multiverse. Perhaps he should be forgiving. He should let his loyal servant experience the joy that is reserved for only the few lucky ones. No! Samael turned his back on the city, allowing his jealousy to fester inside him. The fact that Maz had a mate when he'd lost his own made it impossible for him to forgive and forget. Maz would pay, just like the rest. They will all pay. Heading back inside, he paused at a rough-line drawing that was tacked on the wall of his inner sanctum. He remembered doing the draw ages ago, when time was still new. There were 6 figures standing together, 5 males and 1 female, similar expressions on their face. A happy family. How long ago that was. Trust was in short supply between the siblings now. It had all started with that bloody prophecy, and things had spiraled out from there. Now he went long stretches without seeing any of his brothers, and Nev had been absent for so long it had been difficult to recall her face before she'd reappeared so recently. Samael puzzled at her appearance now. Perhaps it was the prophecy rearing its head, gathering them all together before the apocalypse. Nev and her brood were supposed to hearken the beginning of the end for Sheraton, and Samael couldn't feel sorry for the old bastard. For all he cared, the devil could stand to be taken down a peg or two, and he felt the most qualified to deliver such a dressing down. Still, he had to bide his time. Sheraton might be the single most powerful being in the multiverse, and he would not go down easy. That's why the prophecy was so crucial. It would expose a weakness that Samael could exploit if he played his cards right. There had to be a reason behind Nev's reappearance, but Samael couldn't see it, not yet. He was usually good at puzzling out these things, but for now, he remained stumped. There is still time, he told himself. Time to use your sister as a weapon to bring Sheraton to his knees. Once the devil is brought down, the angel of death can take his place. Samael turned away from the drawing, the wheels in his mind turning. If he was going to figure out Nev's motivation for coming out of hiding, then he was going to have to determine the role of the human female who seemed at the crux of Nev's actions, which meant he was going to have to pay a visit to his pet vampire. The end. This has been The Vampire Tales, Called by Midnight, Fae Wilds Series Book 8, written by W.J. May, copyright 2023 by W.J. May, narrated by Kathleen Starr Hall.